Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The wind howled like a wounded beast, dragging biting snow through the streets of what was once a bustling city. Buildings stood as frozen tombstones, iced over and forgotten under the thick blanket of white. The world had gone quiet, too quiet after the sudden freeze. No engines revived, no people shouted, and no birds dared to soar through the sky. All that remained was the unrelenting cold and the silence of the dead. Ethan trudged through the knee-deep snow, each step slow and deliberate, his breath visible in the air, a cloud of mist that quickly dissipated in the harsh wind. He pulled his scarf tighter around his face, feeling the ice form on his eyelashes, making it harder to blink. His eyes scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, not even a stray dog, only the cold, endless white. He couldn't help but think back to the day it all began, the day the world changed forever. It had been just another Thursday morning. Ethan had been in his lab, running simulations on climate patterns, something he dedicated his life to. There had been warnings, of course, for years. Scientists like him had predicted that something was coming, but no one had expected it to happen so fast. No one had thought it could happen in a matter of hours. It started with a drop in temperature, a small, almost unnoticeable dip. But within hours, that dip turned into a free fall. The skies darkened, clouds rolling in like a black curtain, blocking out the sun. And then the snow came at first. It was light, almost peaceful. But as the hours passed, it intensified, growing thicker and more relentless. By the end of the day, the entire city was covered in snow. Roads became impassable, cars abandoned on highway, power grids veiled as the temperature continued to drop, and then silent. The government had assured everyone that this was temporary, a freak event, but Ethan knew better. This was no fluke of nature. This was a new reality, a permanent winter. He had tried to warn people, but it was too late. Society collapsed within days. There was no time to organize, no time to prepare. People turned on each other as food ran out, and the power remained off. Stores were looted, homes ransacked, and soon enough, the city was reduced to nothing more than a frozen wasteland, littered with the remains of what once was. Ethan's seat crunched against the icy ground as he made his way back to the bunker. He could see it now, a small, nondescript building, partially buried under the snow. To anyone else, it would have looked like just another abandoned structure. But beneath it lay their temporary refuge, a place that had kept them alive for months now. He reached the heavy door and knocked 3 times. A narrow slot slid open, and a pair of wary eyes peeked through. Then the door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside, greeted by the warmth of a small wood stove and the tense faces of the survivors. "Any luck?" Sarah asked. Standing by the fire, she was the de facto leader of their small group, a woman hardened by the realities of survival. Her brown hair was tied back in a messy bun, her eyes sharp and tired. She had once been a wilderness guide, someone who thrived in nature, but this was different even. She struggled here. Ethan shook his head, pulling off his snow-covered coat and hanging it on a makeshift rack near the door. "Nothing. It's completely dead out there. No movement, no animals, no sign of other people." Sarah's face darkened. They had been hoping to find another group of survivors, or at the very least, some food. Their supplies were running dangerously low. The bunker, while secure and insulated, was not meant for long-term living. The canned goods they had scavenged were nearly gone, and the cold made it impossible to grow anything. "What about the storm?" Sarah asked, glancing toward the small window that gave them a limited view of the outside world. "Is it coming this way?" Ethan nodded grimly. "It's moving fast. We've got maybe a day before it hits us." Sarah cursed under her breath, her fingers tightening around the handle of her knife. "We need to go on another run. We almost out of food, and Liam needs more medicine." Liam, her younger brother, lay on a cot in the corner of the room, covered in blankets, his face pale and thin. He had been sick for weeks, the cold only making things worse. They had run out of antibiotics days ago, and without them, his chances of survival were slim. "I'll go," Ethan offered. "We can head south. I saw an old grocery store on my way back. It might still have something left." "I am coming with you," Sarah said immediately. "No," Ethan replied, shaking his head. "You need to stay here and keep the others in line. I can handle it." Sarah stared at him for a moment, her eyes searching his face, before finally nodding. "Fine, but take Joey with you." Joey was a teenager, barely 17, but he had proven himself useful in the past. He was quick on his feet and knew how to handle himself in a fight, which was more than could be said for most of the group. Ethan wasn't too thrilled about bringing the kid along, but he knew Sarah was right. It was too dangerous to go out alone. "Be careful," Sarah said, her voice low, "and if you see Marcus or his people, don't engage. Just get the supplies and get back here." Ethan nodded. Marcus was the leader of another group of survivors, if you could call them that. They had once tried to form an alliance with Marcus, but it quickly became clear that he was only interested in taking what they had. He ruled through fear and violence, and his men were no different. They had crossed paths a few times, but so far they had managed to avoid a direct confrontation. Ethan knew that if it ever came to that, they wouldn't stand a chance. He grabbed his gear and headed toward the door, Joey already waiting for him with a backpack slung over his shoulder. The kid looked nervous, but determined. "Ready?" asked. Joey nodded, pulling his scarf up over his face. "Let us do this." They stepped out into the cold, the wind immediately biting at their exposed skin. Ethan led the way, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The storm was still a ways off, but the sky had already begun to darken, thick clouds rolling in like a tidal wave. They didn't have much time. The grocery store was about a mile south, but in these conditions, it might as well have been 10. Every step felt like a battle, the snow making it nearly impossible to move quickly. By the time they reached the store, both men were exhausted, their limbs numb from the cold. Ethan pushed open the door, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. Inside, the store was a wreck. Shelves had been toppled, their contents scattered across the floor. Broken glass crunched beneath their boots as they moved through the aisles, searching for anything that might still be edible. "Over here," Joey called, crouching down by a shelf near the back. He held up a can of beans, his face lighting up with relief. "It's not much, but it's something." Ethan nodded. Stuffing the can into his bag, they continued to search, finding a few more cans and some dried goods, but it was clear that the store had been picked over long ago. Still, it was better than nothing. Just as they were about to leave, Ethan heard something, a faint noise like footsteps in the snow. He froze, motioning for Joey to stay quiet. The noise came again. Louder this time, someone was outside. Ethan's heart raced as he pulled out his knife, his eyes darting toward the window. Through the frosted glass, he could just make out the shape of a figure moving toward the door. It wasn't really one of Marcus' men, too small, too slow, but whoever it was, they weren't too alone. He grabbed Joey's arm and whispered, "We need to move now." They slipped out the bag, moving quickly and quietly through the snow. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, his breath catching in his throat as he saw more figures emerging from the shadow. There were at least 5 of them, all armed and heading straight for the store. Though Ethan hissed at, pushing Joey ahead of him. The kids sprinted through the snow, Ethan close behind. They ducked behind an old car, crouching low as the figures passed by, their voices muffled by the wind. Ethan held his breath, waiting until they were out of sight before pulling Joey to his feet. "Let's get the hell out of here." They ran in the cold air, burning their lungs, but neither of them stopped until they were safely back at the bunker. Ethan banged on the door, and it swung open, just as the first flakes of the coming storm began to fall. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with worry. Ethan handed her the bag of supplies, his chest heaving with exertion. "We ran into some trouble, but we were fine for now." Sarah glanced at Joey, who nodded in agreement. "Good, but the storm size almost here. We need to hunker down." Ethan nodded, glancing out the window as the wind began to pick up, swirling the snow in thick, blinding waves. The storm had arrived, and there would be no leaving the bunker for days, maybe longer. Inside, the small group of survivors gathered around the wood stove, the flickering flames casting shadows on the wall. The temperature inside the bunker was barely tolerable, but it was infinitely better than the deadly cold outside. Ethan sat by the fire, rubbing his hands together to bring back some feeling, his mind still racing from the close call at the grocery store. Sarah handed him a cup of water, her expression tense. "Those people you saw, could they have been Marcus' men?" More like another group trying to survive, but there were too many of them, and they were armed. Sarah frowned, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed. "It's only going to get worse as more people get desperate. We were going to see more of this. We have to be ready for the possibility that someone will come after what little we have." Ethan nodded, staring into the fire. The flickering flames reminded him of the warmth that once existed outside, a warmth that was now only a distant memory. He knew Sarah was right. It wasn't just the weather that was a threat. It was people desperation made people dangerous, and as food and supplies ran out, the chances of violent encounters would only increase. Liam coughed weakly from his cot in the corner, his frail body shivering under the blanket. Sarah's gaze flicked over to him, her face softening for a moment. Then she hardened again, looking at Ethan with determination. "I can let him die," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "He needs more medicine. We don't have much time." Ethan's heart sank. Liam's eye condition had worsened dramatically over the past few days. The cold was draining what little strength the boy had left, and without proper medical treatment, it was only a matter of time. But getting medicine meant another dangerous supply run, and this time, they couldn't risk running into another group, or worse, market. "I'll think of something," Ethan promised. "There has to be something we haven't tried yet." Sarah sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. "I don't know, Ethan. I feel like we're running out of options." "We can give up," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "We've made it this far. We'll figure it out." The wind howled outside, the storm battering the walls of the bunker. They were trapped here for the foreseeable future, but Ethan's mind was already working. They couldn't stay in the bunker forever. Eventually, they would have to move, and if they were going to move, they needed a plan. For now, though, there was nothing they could do but wait. The storm raged for 3 days. The relentless cold seeped into the walls of the bunker, and even with the fire burning constantly, the temperature inside dropped dangerously low. Food became scarcer and rationing became stricter. Liam's condition worsened. His cough was constant now, his breathing labored, and his skin pale and cold to the touch. Ethan spent most of his time in a corner, poring over old maps and trying to come up with a plan. There was a rumored government shelter up north, one that was said to have been stocked with supplies and able to withstand the worst of the cold. But it was only a rumor. No one had actually seen the shelter, and making the journey would be perilous, especially in these conditions. Still, it was the only lead they had. On the 4th day, when the storm finally began to subside, Ethan approached Sarah, the map in his hand. "I think I've found a way out of this," he said, spreading the map out on the table. "There's a government facility to the north. It's supposed to be a safe haven stocked with food, medicine, and supplies. If we can make it there, we might have a chance." Sarah studied the map, her brow furrowed. "That's a long way, Ethan, and we don't even know if it really exists." "I know," Ethan replied, "but it's the best option we've got. Staying here isn't sustainable. We're running out of food," and Liam, his voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Liam didn't have much time left. Sarah was silent for a moment, her gaze shifting between the map and her brother, who lay motionless on his cot, his breathing shallow. She knew the risks, but she also knew that staying in the bunker would be a slow death for all of them. "How do you propose we get there?" she asked finally. "We'll need to gather as many supplies as we can and leave as soon as possible," Ethan said. "It's a long journey, but if we plan carefully, we can make it. We'll have to avoid Marcus and his men, of course, but I think we can manage." Sarah nodded slowly, her mind already working through the logistics. "We'll need weapons, and we'll need to move fast. If Marcus catches wind of where we were going, he'll try to take whatever we have."
Agreed.
Ethan said we should leave at first light tomorrow. "I'll check the weather patterns. If the storm holds off, we should have a clear window for a few days." They spent the rest of the day preparing the bunker. Supplies were divided up into packs, and weapons were sharpened. Joey, ever eager to prove himself, took inventory of their remaining food and water. It wasn't telling much, but it was bundled up in extra blankets, and Sarah made sure they had enough of his medicine to last a few more days. After that, it would be up to the shelter to provide the rest. As night fell, the group huddled together by the fire, the weight of what lay ahead heavy on everyone's mind. No one spoke much. The silence was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional groan of the wind outside. Ethan sat next to Sarah, his eyes focused on the flames. "You were doing the right thing," he said quietly. "Liam needs this chance." Sarah didn't respond right away. She stared into the fire, her face tight with worry. "I just hope I'm not leading us into a trap," she finally said. "I hope that place actually exists." "It's not our best shot," Ethan replied. "We can stay here, and besides, we survived this long. We'll make it." Sarah didn't look convinced, but she nodded nonetheless. "We'll see." The next morning, they set out. The sun was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, but But at least the storm had passed. The cold was still bone-chilling, but the wind had died down, making the journey slightly more bearable. Ethan led the way, the map tucked inside his jacket for quick reference, while Sarah stayed close to Liam, who was bundled up and carried on a makeshift sled. Joey followed behind, keeping an eye out for any signs of danger. The city was eerily quiet as they moved through the snow-covered street. Buildings loomed over them like silent sentinels, their windows frosted over and their doors frozen shut. Cars were abandoned on the roads, buried under layers of snow, their occupants long since gone. It was a graveyard of the old world. They'd been walking for hours when Ethan heard something. At first it was faint, just a distant hum on the wind. But as they moved further north, the sound grew louder, a low mechanical rumble, unmistakable in the stillness. "Do you hear that?" Joey whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Ethan stopped, motioning for the group to crouch down. They huddled behind a snowbank, listening. The sound was coming closer now, unmistakably the rumble of engines. "Marcus, it had to be. They were patrolling," Sarah said in a low voice, "looking for anyone they can pick off." Ethan cursed under his breath. They had been so careful to avoid Marcus and his men, but now it seemed like they were walking right into their path. "We can talk about them," Ethan said. "Not with Liam." Sarah's face tightened, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Then we need to hide quickly." They moved fast, dragging Liam and the sled into a nearby building that had been half buried by snow. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay, but it was sheltered. They crouched low, peeking out through a broken window as the sound of engines grew louder. Moments later, a convoy of snowmobiles appeared, their sleek, black forms cutting through the snow with ease. Marcus' men rode them, their faces covered by masks, their weapons slung over their shoulders. There were 5 of them, all heavily armed, and they passed by the building without noticing the group huddled inside. Ethan held his breath, waiting until the last snowmobile was out of sight before relaxing slightly. "We need to keep moving," he whispered. "We were getting close, but if Marcus finds out where we were headed..." Sarah nodded, already gathering their things. The danger was far from over. Marcus was hunting and they were running out of time. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The virus was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. By the time the public heard the first whispers on the news, entire cities were already in chaos. Hospitals overflowing, streets choked with fear. The media labeled it the Phoenix strain, an apt name for something that seemed to rise from the ashes of normalcy and burn everything it touched. But the true horror lay in its origin and the hidden hands that had carefully constructed it. Mark Donovan knew that better than anyone. Dr. Mark Donovan sat hunched over a dimly lit workstation in his makeshift lab. His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, running simulations and scanning data, but the exhaustion in his eyes told a different story. Weeks of near-constant work had whittled him down to skin and bone, and every hour was a reminder that time was running out. He adjusted his glasses, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and focused once more on the numbers flashing across the screen. This strain wasn't too like anything he'd seen before, and that frightened him more than he cared to admit. The sterile white walls of the lab felt like they were closing in on him. He had once been part of a top-tier research team, a virologist with a promising future. But now it was just him, isolated from the world, racing against time in a desperate attempt to find a cure. Outside, the world burned with panic and sickness, while inside, Mark fought the oppressive silence. His thoughts drifted to the past, to the epidemic that had claimed his family years ago, tragedy that left him scarred, emotionally and mentally. He had promised himself that he would never let something like that happen again. And yet here he was in the midst of another outbreak, one far deadlier than the last. Suddenly, the sharp trill of his phone broke the silence. Mark flinched, nearly knocking over a stack of papers as he grabbed for it. The name on the screen made his heart race. Sarah, his old colleague from the CDC, one of the few people he still trusted. "Mark, we need you, Sarah's voice was hurried, her usual calm demeanor fraying at the edges. "The situation is worse than we thought. This strain ... it's evolving faster than we can track. People are dropping like flies." Mark leaned back, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I know, Sarah, I've been monitoring it. This thing ... it's not natural." There was a pause on the other end, a hesitation that only confirmed what Mark had already suspected. "We've been getting strange reports," Sarah said, her voice lowered to a whisper. There's something going on behind the scenes, something the government isn't telling us. I think this virus was engineered, marked deliberately. Mark's stomach turned. He had thought the same thing, but had pushed it down, convincing himself it was paranoia. Yet hearing Sarah say it made it real. Who would do this and why? I don't know, she replied, but Helix Industries, they were too involved. They've been controlling the flow of information and the resources. And there's something else. People are disappearing. Mark scientists, doctors, those who know too much. Mark swallowed hard. You think they'll come after me? A cold silence stretched between them. Sarah didn't need to answer for him to know the truth. You need to be careful, she said. Finally, I'll help however I can, but we're running out of time. We need to find a cure, and we need to figure out who's behind this before it's too late. The call ended, leaving Mark with a creeping sense of dread. Helix Industries, he had heard rumors about them, whispers of unethical experiments, genetic tampering, and corporate greed. But this was something else entirely. If they were behind the virus, then humanity was facing a danger far greater than a mere pandemic. Mark stood from his desk and grabbed his jacket. His lab wasn't safe anymore, not if Helix was involved. He quickly packed what few supplies he could into a worn backpack, vials of samples, data drives, and his personal note. He had to go off the grid, disappear before they found him. His only hope was to meet up with Sarah. Maybe together they could piece together the truth and develop a cure. He turned off the lights and stepped outside, the cold night air hitting his face like a slap. The streets were eerily quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. In the distance, he could hear the faint wail of sirens, a reminder that the city was on the verge of collapse. As he walked briskly down the alley, his mind raced. If Helix had engineered the virus, they had done so for a reason. Population control, a bioweapon, Mark couldn't truly be sure. But one thing was clear. The virus was designed to spread quickly and mutate even faster. Humanity just stand a chance unless he could stop it. Just as Mark rounded the corner, he caught sight of a black SUV idling across the street. His heart skipped a beat. The windows were tinted, but he knew immediately who they were, operatives sent by Helix to find him. He quickened his pace, keeping his head down, his mind screaming at him to stay calm. He couldn't lead them to Sarah. He had to lose them first. With his backpack slung over one shoulder, Mark slipped into a narrow side street, his breath coming in short gasps. He could hear the distant sound of footsteps behind him. They were following. His pulse quickened, and he broke into a run, weaving through the dark alleyways of the city, his mind calculating every turn, every shadow. He cursed under his breath. He wasn't cut out for this kind of thing. He was a scientist, not a fugitive, but now he had no choice. Helix had made sure of that. As he sprinted through the maze of streets, his mind flashed back to his family, their faces, their laughter, the way they had vanished from his life, like a dream dissolving into the morning light. They had been taken by a virus just like this one, and Mark had failed to save them. He wouldn't fail again. He ducked into an abandoned warehouse, his chest heaving with exertion. The footsteps were getting closer. He could hear them now, steady and deliberate. They were closing in. Mark scanned the room, his eyes landing on a set of stairs that led to the roof. Without hesitation, he bolted toward them, taking the steps two at a time. The cold metal railing burned against his palm, but he didn't care. He had to keep moving. He burst onto the rooftop, the city sprawling out before him, a labyrinth of concrete and steel. He could hear the operatives below, their voices low and authoritative. They were searching the building. Mark looked around frantically, his gaze settling on a fire escape that led down the back of the building. He climbed over the edge of the roof and onto the narrow metal ladder, his hands trembling as he descended. The sound of footsteps echoed from below. They had found him. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he descended faster, his feet slipping on the cold metal rung. He could see the ground below, just a few more feet. He could make it. He had to make it. Just as he reached the bottom, he heard the crack of gunfire. Mark threw himself to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The operatives were shooting at him. He had to move. Scrambling to his feet, Mark took off into the night, his legs burning with exhaustion. He could hear the operatives shouting behind him, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. They were gaining on him. Mark's mind raced. He needed to get out of the city. He needed to find Sarah. She was his only chance, their only chance. But first, he had to lose the operative. He darted into another alley, his eyes scanning for a way out. Ahead, he saw a manhole cover without thinking. He dropped to his knees and yanked it open, the smell of sewage wafting up from below. It wasn't ideal, but it was his only option. Mark lowered himself into the darkness, pulling the cover back over his head. The world above faded away, leaving him in the cold, wet silence of the underground. He crouched in the shadows, his breath coming in, shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the operatives above, their footsteps echoing against the pavement as they searched for him, but they wouldn't find him, not here. As the sound of their footsteps faded, Mark let out a long, slow breath. He had escaped for now, but he knew it wouldn't truly be long before they found him again. Helix was relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had him. He stood in the darkness, his mind racing. He had to keep moving. He had to find Sarah. Together, they could figure out the truth. Together, they could stop Helix. But time was running out. Mark moved through the damp, narrow tunnels beneath the city, guided only by the faint glow of his phone screen. The sewers were a maze, but he had no choice above ground. The city was crawling with operatives, and Helix was undoubtedly watching every exit. His body was running on adrenaline, and though his muscles ached, he pushed forward, the weight of his backpack and the urgency of his mission driving him. Every so often, he stopped, listening for any sign that he was being followed. But the only sounds were the steady drip of water from the tunnel walls and the occasional scurrying of unseen creatures. He checked his phone again, sending a brief message to Sarah. "I am underground safe for now. Meet at waypoints." "Sarah, sir," his reply came quickly. "Understood. Be careful." The tension was suffocating, but knowing Sarah was out there fighting alongside him gave Mark the sliver of hope he needed. He'd always admired her strength, her ability to remain calm under pressure. Now, more than ever, they had to stay sharp. Mark navigated his way through the labyrinth, eventually finding an exit that led him out into a rundown industrial district. The streets were deserted, and the windows of the old factories were dark. The place had been abandoned long before the virus hit, but that made it perfect for staying under the radar. As he moved through the shadows, his mind kept replaying everything Sarah had said about Helix Industries. The thought that the virus was a manufactured bioweapon dawned at him, threatening to erode his sanity. The sheer cruelty of it, that people were dying, not from some natural disaster, but from deliberate human actions, was too much to bear. It felt like every step he took weighed heavier with the knowledge of what he'd uncovered. Finally, Mark arrived at the meeting spot, a dilapidated storage warehouse near the edge of town. The building was a relic from another time forgotten and left to decay. He slipped inside through a broken side door and waited, keeping close to the walls, his nerves fraying as the minutes ticked by. A faint rustle from the far side of the warehouse made him freeze, but the moment he saw Sarah's familiar figure emerge from the shadows, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You made it," she said softly, her voice thick with relief. She looked more tired than usual, the lines under her eyes deeper, but her focus was sharp as ever. "Barely," Mark replied, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "Helix sent people after me. They know I am getting too close." Sarah frowned. They were getting more aggressive. "We don't have much time." Mark handed her a USB drive. "Everything I got from my lab is on here. We need to analyze the data, see if there's anything we missed." Sarah nodded, pocketing the drive. "I've been hearing more rumors about Helix. They were not just covering up the virus, they were controlling who gets the vaccine. There's something off about the whole operation." Mark saw his blood ran cold. "Are you saying they already have a vaccine and they withholding it?" Sarah's lips tightened. "That send up what it looks like, but it's Sarah not ready for mass production. They were holding it back until the virus reaches critical mass, then they'll release it to select groups for a price." Mark's hands clenched into fists. They were going to let people die just to maximize their profits. I knew they were corrupt, but this... Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It gets worse. I've been digging into their files, and it looks like Helix has been working on this virus for years. It wasn't time meant to get out yet, but someone released it early. Whether it was intentional or a mistake, I don't know, but they were scrambling to contain the fallout." Mark paced, his mind racing. "So what do? We can take them head on. They've got too much power, too many resources. We expose them." Sarah said Obsidian is working on decrypting more of their files. "Once we have enough evidence, we leak everything. The public won't stand for this, not when they know the truth." Mark wasn't convinced. He had seen how powerful corporations like Helix operated, how they manipulated the media buried scandals, and silenced whistleblowers. You really think that'll be enough? What if they find us before we can release the data? Sarah met his gaze, her eyes hard. Then we take them down with us. Mark could see the fire in her eyes, the determination that had always set her apart. She wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting for justice, and now, so was he. All right, Mark said, taking a deep breath. What's on the next step? Obsidian's got a lead on one of Helix's secondary labs, Sarah explained. It's us where they were developing the vaccine. We break in, get the data, and prove they've been holding it back. If we can get a sample, we can replicate it and release it to the public. Mark nodded. Sounds like a suicide mission. Sarah smirked. That's the spirit. They spent the next few hours going over their plan in detail, marking escape routes and contingency plans in case things went wrong. But even as they prepared, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The virus was mutating faster than anyone had anticipated, and every day they waited, more people died. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. The knowledge that he might be one of the few who could stop this nightmare from consuming humanity. Finally, as the first light of dawn filtered through the broken windows of the warehouse, Sarah stood up, tucking her gear into her bag. We need to move. Mark followed suit, his body aching from the lack of sleep, but his mind razor sharp. Together they slipped out of the warehouse and into the early morning streets, where the world felt eerily quiet, as if it too was waiting for the storm to break. They made their way to the outskirts of the city, where Helix's secondary lab was hidden in plain sight. From the outside, it looked like a typical corporate office building, sleek, modern, unassuming. But Mark knew what lay beneath the surface. This was where Helix had been running their experiments, where they'd been developing the virus and the vaccine that could save millions if only they would release it. Mark and Sarah positioned themselves in the shadows across the street, waiting for the right moment to strike. The lab was heavily guarded, with security patrols circling the perimeter. But they had a plan, and Obsidian side hackers had already taken down the building. External camera, ready, Sarah whispered. Mark nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. Let's do this. They moved quickly and silently, slipping past the guards and into the building through a side entrance. The inside was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the wall. Mark's skin crawled as they made their way deeper into the facility, passing rows of empty offices and labs filled with gleaming equipment. Finally, they reached the central lab where the vaccine was being developed. The room was filled with high-tech machinery, and at the far end, a row of containment units held samples of the virus and the vaccine. Sarah moved to the computer terminal, quickly typing in commands as she accessed the lab. As stated, I am in, she said, her voice tense. I am downloading everything. Mark kept watch, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of trouble. But just as the download finished, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. His stomach dropped. They were coming, Mark hissed. We need to move. Sarah grabbed the USB drive, tucking it into her jacket as they sprinted for the exit. But as they rounded the corner, they came face to face with a squad of Helix operatives, their guns trained on Mark and Sarah. Freeze, one of the operatives barked, his voice cold and mechanical. Mark's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no way out, they were trapped. But then, without warning, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out. A second later, the building cell fire alarm blared, the deafening sound echoing through the corridor. Obsidian Sarah whispered, a hint of a smile on her lip. In the chaos that followed, Mark and Sarah slipped past the confused operatives and out into the night. As they ran, the sound of sirens and shouting faded into the distance, replaced by the steady beat of their footsteps on the pavement. They had the data, they had the proof. Now all they had to do was release it to the world. But as they disappeared into the darkness, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Helix wouldn't give up that easily. They were too powerful, too ruthless. And Mark knew that the battle for humanity's survival had only just begun. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The night sky had never looked so deceptively calm above the city, a serene blanket of stars spread out as if nothing had changed. But for Captain Alex Kane, everything had. Only hours earlier, the world as he knew it was obliterated. New York, London, Beijing all turned to rubble. Now it was just him and the quiet hum of alien ships above their presence a constant reminder of humanity's sense of helplessness. He crouched in the wreckage of what had once been a bustling commercial district, the smell of burning steel and concrete mixing with the scent of singed flesh. The rest of his unit had been decimated in the first wave. Only a handful of civilians huddled in the shadows with him, now looking to him for leadership, though they barely knew him. It didn't matter. They had no one else. Alex wiped the grime from his forehead with the back of his hand, his fingers trembling. He led special ops missions in the Middle East, Central Asia, and God knows where else, but he'd never seen destruction like this. The aliens didn't fight like humans. They didn't invade with tanks or planes. Instead, they hovered silently, sending devastating pulses of energy that leveled buildings and shattered infrastructure, while massive robots, as tall as skyscrapers, patrolled the streets below, crushing anything in their path. The invasion was methodical, precise, ruthless. Behind him, a nervous voice broke the silence. "Higher Captain, what do we do now?" Alex turned to face the speaker. It was Sarah Miller, a young engineer. She was covered in dust, her face pale, but her eyes showed a spark of defiance. She had proven useful earlier, helping them navigate through a collapsed subway tunnel. Now she looked at him like he was the only thing holding her together. "Summarily move. Dray," he said quietly but firmly. "Time we can. Stay here." Sarah glanced at the rest of the group. There were about a dozen civilians, men, women, and even a few children. They were ordinary people plucked from their normal lives and thrown into a nightmare, and most of them had never even held a gun. But right now, that didn't matter. What mattered was survival. "How far do you think we'll get?" one man, probably in his early 50s, asked. He was a doctor, Dr. Miguel Santos, if Alex remembered correctly. His hands shook as he clutched a small first aid kit, like it was the last piece of civilization he had left. "We'll get as far as we need to," Alex replied, though even he didn't believe the words fully. The truth was, he had no idea how far they could get, or where they were even going. He only knew they had to keep moving. Staying in one place would mean certain death. Without another word, Alex led them through the crumbling streets, careful to avoid the open areas where the alien drones patrolled. Their advanced technology made it impossible to fight head-on. They'd all tried that earlier, and it had been a massacre. Bullets bounced off the aliens, shimmering shields, while their own weapons vaporized anything in their path. "Stay low," Alex whispered as they crept through the remains of an office building. The windows were blown out, leaving sharp shards of glass glinting in the pale moonlight. Sarah helped one of the older women navigate over the debris, her engineering expertise evident in her quick thinking. Dr. Santos stayed at the rear, making sure the kids didn't fall behind. The group moved like shadows, slipping between the ruins of what had once been a proud city. Alex felt a pang in his chest as they passed a toppled statue, one of the city's icons, reduced to nothing more than rubble. It was a stark reminder that humanity wasn't just losing a battle. It was losing its identity. They ducked into a small alleyway, the oppressive silence broken only by the distant hum of alien machines. Alex held up a hand, signaling the group to stop. His instincts kicked in as he peered around the corner. The streets ahead were filled with alien patrols, tall, imposing figures with sleek armor and glowing eyes, their energy rifles humming as they scanned the area for survivors. "Too many of them," Alex muttered under his breath. Sarah crouched beside him, her face tense. "Tarbe, what do? "We wait," he said. "They'll move on soon enough." But waiting wasn't easy. Every second felt like an eternity, and Alex could feel the fear radiating off the civilians behind him. They were terrified, rightfully so. These weren't trial soldiers. They were engineers, doctors, office workers, parents. And yet here they were, thrust into a war they never asked for. Finally, the alien patrol passed, their heavy footsteps fading into the distance. Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and motioned for the group to follow him. They made their way through the alley, keeping to the shadows, until they reached a collapsed subway entrance. The sign above it was barely legible, but Alex knew it led to one of the few underground tunnels that hadn't been completely destroyed in the initial attack. "This way," he said, leading them down the crumbling step. The air in the subway was thick with dust, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the darkness. The group descended cautiously, their footsteps echoing off the cold concrete wall. Alex pulled out a flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the gloom, revealing the twisted wreckage of subway cars and debris strewn across the track. "Watch your steps," Sarah whispered, helping one of the older women navigate the debris. They moved deeper into the tunnels, the oppressive silence swallowing them whole. For a moment, Alex allowed himself to hope that they might be safe here at least for a little while. But that hope was shattered when they heard the distant rumble of footsteps, heavy mechanical footsteps. "They were coming. Dr. Santos," said his voice tight with fear. Alex cursed under his breath. The aliens were thorough. They wouldn't leave any part of the city unchecked. They had to keep moving, but where every route seemed to lead to another death trap. And then as they rounded a corner, they saw it, a shimmering blue force field blocking the tunnel ahead. "What the hell is that?" Sarah muttered, her eyes wide with shock. "Alien tech," Alex said grimly, the sealing off the tunnel. They were trapped. The aliens were systematically cutting off all escape routes, herding the survivors into a kill zone. Alex's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. They couldn't Tringo back, the patrols would be there waiting for them, and they couldn't Tringo forward. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed through the tunnel, a whisper, almost too soft to hear. Alex froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the darkness. "Pilots coming from over there." She pointed to a small alcove on the side of the tunnel, barely visible in the dim light. Alex motioned for the group to stay back as he cautiously approached the alcove. His heart pounded in his chest as he rounded the corner, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. And then he saw a figure huddled in the shadows, trembling. "Don't shoot," a voice rasped. "Please, don't shoot." Alex lowered his gun slightly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight before him. It was an alien, a scout, judging by its smaller size and less intimidating armor. Its body was battered, its armor cracked and sparking. One of its arms hung limp at its side, and its glowing eyes flickered weakly. "You've got to be kidding me." The alien raised its remaining arm in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to fight," it said, its voice distorted but understandable in hurry. I need help." Alex stared at the alien, his mind reeling. This was the enemy. The beings that had destroyed his home, killed his comrades, and wiped out half the human population. And now one of them was asking for help. "You ever got some nerve?" he growled, his grip tightening on his gun. "Wait," Sarah said, stepping forward. "Maybe it knows something. Something that can help us." Alex glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "Kara, you kidding, right? This thing is the reason we in this mess. Or it could be the key to getting out of it." Hershey shot back. "We need answers, Alex, and this might be our only chance to get them." For a long moment, Alex considered her words. Every fiber of his being screamed to put a bullet in the alien's head, had to end its miserable life as payback for the destruction it had caused. But Sarah was right. They needed answers. And if this alien could provide them. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth, "but if it tries anything, I'll kill it myself." I can help you. I know why we are here. I know why we invaded." Alex narrowed his eyes, his fingers still hovering over the trigger. Tears start talking. The alien hesitated for a moment, its glowing eyes flickering again. "We came here not to conquer, but to survive. Our planet is dying. We need your resources to survive. Without them, we will perish." Alex's grip tightened on his rifle, but he kept it pointed at the ground. "And how many humans do you plan to kill to make that happen?" The alien's eyes flickered, its breathing labored. "Our leaders, they don't care. They will take what we need. Your people, are just obstacles." But not all of us agree. Some of us believe there is another way. "Another way?" Sarah asked, stepping closer despite Alex's warning glare. "Blair, what way you mean peace?" The alien nodded weakly, its gaze drifting to the damaged force field at the end of the tunnel. "We tried to speak with your leaders before, but they refused. Now the invasion has begun, and it's soon too late for negotiation." Alex's jaw clenched. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The idea that humanity had even a sliver of a chance to avoid all this death and destruction was enraging. "So what, you're telling us we should just let you take everything?" "No," the alien wheezed. "I am saying there is a way to stop this. But you must destroy the core of our mothership. Without it, we cannot complete the terraforming process. Earth will remain as it did." Sarah's eyes widened. "The core, how do we destroy it?" The alien said, head lolled to the side, and for a moment, Alex thought it had died. But then it spoke again, its voice barely more than a raspberry. "There is a weapon. hidden in one of your military bases. It was designed to fight us. Your people didn't know, but it is your only chance. The base is north in the mountain. Al exchanged a look with Sarah. They had heard about classified weapons programs before the invasion, but nothing had ever been confirmed. If what the alien was saying was true, they might actually have a chance to fight back. But it was a long shot. The military base could be destroyed. The weapon might not even exist, and even if it did, how were they supposed to get to it, let alone use it against the alien? Why are you telling us this? The alien's eyes dimmed, its body trembling with each breath. Because I do not want to see more death. My people, they're wrong. And I have failed, but you still have a chance. Take it. Before Alex could say another word, the alien's body convulsed, and then it went still. The light in its eyes flickered out, leaving only a lifeless shell. Sarah knelt beside it, checking for any signs of life, but there was none. She glanced up at Alex, her face pale. Do you think it was telling the truth? Alex sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I don't. Well, we don't have much of a choice, do we? The group was silent for a moment, the weight of their situation settling heavily on their shoulder. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and outmatched in every way. And now they were being told that their only hope lay in some secret weapon that might not even exist. But what other option did they have? We go north, Alex finally said, his voice firm. If this weapon exists, we were going to find it. The group gathered their supplies and prepared to move out. The journey would be long and dangerous, but the thought of a possible solution gave them a sliver of hope. As they made their way out of the tunnel and into the cold night air, Alex felt the weight of responsibility settle even more heavily on his shoulders. The people following him were depending on him, and for the first time since the invasion began, he had a plan. The trek north was grueling. They moved through forests, across desolate highways, and over jagged terrain. The sky was constantly filled with the hum of alien drones, their lights sweeping across the grounds like searchlights. They had to be careful, avoiding open areas and staying out of sight whenever possible. The resilient Sarah's technical expertise was invaluable as they encountered alien-based. She managed to disable a few smaller drones and even reverse engineer some of their communication equipment, allowing them to listen in on alien frequency. Dr. Santos continued to patch up wounds, both physical and emotional, as best he could, while Tyler, the teenager who had proven to be a quick learner, kept watch during the nights, alerting the group to any nearby threat. But despite their progress, the journey was taking its toll. Supplies were running low, and the constant fear of discovery weighed heavily on everyone. Every day felt like a gamble, but Alex kept them moving, pushing them toward the mountain base the alien had mentioned. After several days of traveling, they finally saw it. Hidden deep in the mountains, shrouded by mist and camouflaged against the rocky terrain, was the military base. It was eerily silent. The gates were partially destroyed, the concrete barriers smashed as if by something massive. Looks like the aliens got here first, Sarah muttered, surveying the damage. Alex approached cautiously, his rifle at the ready. There were no signs of life, no bodies, no alien patrol. But that didn't mean it was safe. Stay close, he ordered, leading the group through the wreckage. The base was in shambles, but there were still areas that had been untouched. Alex led them deeper into the compound, navigating through broken corridors and ruined offices. They finally reached what appeared to be the research and development wing, a heavily fortified section of the base that had survived the initial attack. This has to be it, Alex said, his heart pounding as they entered the facility. The lab was filled with advanced military tech, most of it in pieces. But in the center of the room, partially obscured by debris, was what they had come for. It was a weapon, unlike anything Alex had ever seen. It was sleek, black and metallic, with glowing blue lines running along its surface. It looked more like something the aliens would use than anything designed by humans. This must be the weapon the alien was talking about, Sarah said, her voice filled with awe as she approached it. Dr. Santos examined the readouts on the nearby console, his brow furrowed in concentration. It's powered by some kind of energy source I've never seen before. This isn't just human technology. There's that alien tech integrated into this. Alex's stomach tightened. The idea that humanity had been working on something like this long before the invasion wasn't exactly comforting. How can we use it? Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the weapon, set control interface. I think so, but it's not going to be easy. This thing was designed to be used by highly trained personnel. We were going to need to figure out how it works, and fast. Alex glanced around the lab. We don't have time. The aliens are probably already on their way. As if on cue, a low rumble echoed through the mountains, followed by the familiar hum of alien ships. Alex cursed under his breath. They had been found. Sarah, get that thing working. We'll buy you time, he said. His voice cold and determined. The group sprang into action. Tyler and Dr. Santos began barricading the doors, using whatever debris they could find to block the entrances. Alex took position near one of the windows, scanning the skies for any sign of alien forces. The rumble grew louder, and soon the sky was filled with the glowing lights of alien ships. They hovered above the base, their sleek angular designs casting long shadows over the compound. They were here, Alex muttered, gripping his rifle tightly. The first wave came swiftly. Alien drones descended from the ships, their weapons charging with a faint hum. Alex fired off a few rounds, his bullets pinging uselessly against their energy shield. But he wasn't trying to kill them. He was trying to buy Sarah time. How's it going back there? He shouted over the sound of gunfire. I am working on it. Sarah called back, her hands flying over the control. The weapon hummed to life, its glowing blue lines brightening as the power surged through it. Barry, I just need a few more minutes. The alien drones continued their assault, their energy weapons tearing through the barricade. Tyler ducked behind cover, firing off shots whenever he could, while Dr. Santos did his best to tend to the wounded. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he reloaded his rifle. They were running out of time. If Sarah couldn't get the weapon working soon, they were all going to die. But then, just as the drones breached the final barricade, Sarah shouted, Sarah, I've got it. The weapon hummed with power, its blue lines pulsing with energy. Alex did hesitate. He grabbed the control interface and aimed the weapon at the alien ships hovering above. Let's see how you like that. A blinding beam of energy shot out from the weapon, slicing through the sky and striking the nearest alien ship. The ship shuddered, shields flickering as the energy beam tore through its hull. With a deafening explosion, the ship disintegrated, sending debris raining down on the base. The alien drones faltered, their coordination breaking as the mothership lost control. Alex fired again, taking down another ship, and then another. The tide of battle was turning. The remaining alien forces retreated, their ships fleeing into the night. Sky, the hum of their engines faded into the distance, leaving the base in an eerie silence. Alex lowered the weapon, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Tara, we did it. Tara, he muttered, barely believing the word. Sarah collapsed beside him, her face pale but triumphant. Yeah, we did. The group gathered around, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief. They had survived, they had fought back, and for the first time since the invasion began, they had hope. But as Alex stared at the wreckage of the alien ships, a sense of unease settled over him. This battle was over, but the war was far from won. The aliens would return stronger and more determined than ever. And next time they might not be so lucky. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The sky above Ethan, South Village, had turned to an eternal shade of dull gray. No birds flew overhead anymore, and no animals dared approach the ruined fields that surrounded his home. What was left of the town was barricaded and fortified, but it didn't entirely look like a fortress. It looked like a tomb. The once vibrant village where he'd grown up had been reduced to a series of makeshift barricades, crumbling walls, and debris scattered through the street. The air tasted of ash and burnt wood, a permanent reminder of the last raid that had nearly destroyed them. Ethan Millers stood atop the highest ridge, scanning the horizon through the cracked lens of an old pair of binoculars. His breath came slow and steady, but his muscles remained tense. The distant outline of an enemy scout skittered across his field of view, moving along the edge of the valley below. The Eastern Coalition was sending out more patrols than usual, and that meant trouble. The underground energy reserve buried beneath their village had been a secret for years, but now everyone seemed to know. He lowered the binoculars and slid them into his pack, his jaw clenched tight. For weeks they had been able to fend off the smaller groups, bandits, looters, those desperate enough to fight for scraps. But this was different. This was organized. The coalition wanted what was beneath their feet, and they wouldn't stop until they got it. Sarah, his sister, climbed up the ridge to join him, her face pale and drawn. She was a few years younger than him, but the strain of the constant war had made her look older. Her eyes, once bright and filled with hope, now mirrored the bleak landscape around them. "They're moving closer," she said softly, adjusting the frayed scarf around her neck to block out the chill. "We can't keep this up much longer, Ethan. The village, it's falling apart." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let his gaze fall over the village below them. His people were broken, exhausted from years of scraping by on what little food and water they had left. Supplies were dwindling, and morale was at an all-time low. He saw children helping their parents repair the barricades, the older folks sitting quietly by the fire, their faces with hopelessness. "I know," he muttered finally, "but we have to hold on. As long as we keep them at bay, we have a chance." If they get through, he didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what it would mean. The coalition would seize the energy reserves, and their village would be wiped off the map either by battle or by being abandoned in the aftermath. Sarah looked at him, her voice catching slightly. "We should try to negotiate. Maybe they will listen to reason." "Reason?" Ethan barked a bitter laugh. "You think General Victorian listens to reason? He's not interested in negotiation. He wants control, and control comes with crushing anyone in his way." Sarah flinched at his tone, but she didn't back down. "I know what he sounds like, but if we don't try, we'll all be dead. What's the point of fighting if there's no one left to protect?" Ethan didn't have an answer for her, not one that would ease the burden she carried. He raked a hand through his hair, trying to think of a way out of this mess. Every day felt like another step toward the inevitable. The only reason the coalition hadn't attacked full force yet was because of their sabotage efforts, the supply lines they'd managed to disrupt, the traps they'd set in the outer fields. But those tactics wouldn't hold much longer. "We'll find a way," he promised her, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. As they descended the ridge, a figure emerged from the shadows, moving with the practiced stealth of someone who had lived outside the confines of law and order for a long time. Lila Harper, she was a resource looter, a scavenger who lived by her wits and her ability to navigate the ruins of the old world. Ethan didn't trust her, not entirely, but he couldn't deny that she had been useful since she'd arrived. "Looks like the coalition is gearing up for something big," Layla said, her voice as casual as if she were talking about the weather. "Saw some of their equipment moving into position. Heavy artillery, they were not playing around." Ethan exchanged a glance with Sarah, the unspoken fear between them growing heavier by the second. If they brought in heavy artillery, their defenses wouldn't hold for long. Lila leaned against the wall of a nearby building, brushing a strand of dirty blonde hair out of her face. "But I think I got an idea. You want to like it, but it could work." Ethan crossed his arms. Let Sarah hear it. Lila grinned, but it was the kind of smile that never reached her eye. "The coalition supply line runs through the valley. They've got ammo, food, and enough fuel to keep their tanks rolling. I know a way in an old service tunnel from before the collapse. If we sabotage the line, we can delay their attack, maybe even force them to pull back." Sarah looked uneasy. "And what's this in it for you?" Lila shrugged. "Same as you. I don't want to be under Victor's set boot. Besides, if they take this place, I'll have nowhere to go, and I am betting that energy reserve you've got stashed under this dirt is worth more than a few tanks of gas." Ethan's mind raced. It was a risky move, one that could get them all killed if it went wrong. But they were running out of options. He could feel the pressure closing in from all sides, and the weight of responsibility hung heavy on his shoulder. He looked to Sarah, hoping for a sign that she agreed with the plan. Her expression was conflicted, torn between wanting to protect their home and the danger that Lila's proposal posed. "We don't have much of a choice," Sarah said quietly. "If we do nothing, they'll crush us. But if this works, we might buy ourselves more time." Ethan nodded. His decision made. "Fine, we will go at nightfall." Lila straightened up, a flash of approval in her eyes. "Smart choice, I'll get my gear ready." As she disappeared into the shadows, Ethan felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for Sarah, for the people in the village who depended on him to make the right choices. But with every passing hour, those choices became harder to make. The night was still, almost unnervingly. So Ethan crouched behind a pile of rubble with Lila and Sarah by his side, the cool air biting at his skin. The service tunnel Lila had mentioned was hidden behind an overgrown mound of debris, half buried by time and neglect. "We go in quietly," Lila whispered, her breath barely visible in the dim light. We get to their supplies, plant the charges, and get out. No heroic. Ethan gave a curt nod, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. Their one chance to strike back before the full might of the coalition came crashing down on them. Lila led the way, slipping into the tunnel with the ease of someone who had navigated forgotten paths for years. Ethan followed closely behind, his senses alert for any sign of danger. The tunnel was cramped and smelled of mold and decay, but it provided the cover they needed. Sarah was right behind him, her hand resting on the old pistol she carried. They moved quickly, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that had settled in the tunnel over the years. The distant hum of the coalition ascend machinery grew louder as they neared the end of the passage, and Ethan saw his pulse quicken. Layla stopped at the mouth of the tunnel, peeking out into the valley beyond. Rows of supply trucks and ammunition crates were neatly lined up, guarded by only a handful of soldiers. The coalition had gotten overconfident, assuming that no one would be foolish enough to attack their supply line this deep in enemy territory. "All right," Lila whispered, "we've got 5 minutes to plant the charges and get out of here." Ethan's hands shook slightly as he pulled the small explosives from his pack, but he forced himself to stay calm. They had come too far to screw this up now. Moving with practiced efficiency, they split up, each of them planting charges at key points along the supply line. Ethan could feel the weight of every second ticking by as he worked, his mind racing with the possibility of being discovered. Finally, they were done. Ethan signaled to Sarah and Lila, and they began to retreat back into the tunnel. But just as they reached the entrance, a shout rang out. One of the soldiers had spotted them. "Esto," Ethan hissed, shoving Sarah forward. They bolted down the tunnel, the sound of gunfire echoing behind them as the coalition soldiers opened fire. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest, every muscle in his body screaming for him to move faster. Behind them, the charges exploded, sending a deafening roar through the valley. Flames shot into the sky as the coalition's supplies went up in smoke. But Ethan barely had time to register the success. They had to get out before the soldiers caught up. They burst out of the tunnel and into the night, but their path back to the village was entirely clear. Ethan glanced at Lila, who was already scanning the terrain ahead. "We need to move fast," she muttered, her voice taut with urgency. They sprinted through the rocky terrain, dodging fallen debris and abandoned machinery as they raced back toward the village. The explosion had worked as planned. The coalition supplies were in flames, and the chaos would slow their advance. But it had also drawn attention, and Ethan could hear the shouts of soldiers in the distance. They were coming after them. Sarah stumbled on a loose rock, but Ethan was quick to grab her arm, pulling her back to her feet. "Keep moving," he urged, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His legs burned from the effort. But the adrenaline pushed him forward. He couldn't let them get caught. Not now. Lila took the lead, weaving through the maze of rubble with the precision of someone who had spent years navigating dangerous territory. And then the shadows that stretched out around them. Every dark corner felt like a potential ambush, every sound like the approach of an enemy. They reached the outskirts of the village just as the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon. The sky was still a murky gray, but the faint light brought with it a sense of temporary safety. Ethan slowed his pace, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed. The coalition soldiers had been thrown into disarray by the explosion, and for now it seemed they weren't pursuing. "We made it," Sarah breathed, her voice shaky with relief. Ethan nodded, though the tension in his chest hadn't eased for now. They slipped through the barricades surrounding the village, greeted by the wary stares of the remaining fighters who had kept watch through the night. Most of them were older, too weak to fight on the front lines, but determined to do whatever they could to protect their home. They nodded to Ethan as he passed, their expressions grim. Word of the sabotage would spread quickly, and the villagers would know that the real battle was only just beginning. Lila lingered near the edge of the barricade, watching as Ethan helped Sarah down from a crumbling wall. "We bought ourselves some time," she said quietly, "but it won't be enough." Futuristic, not the type to back down after a hit like that. Ethan shot her a sharp look. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that the next time he comes, he'll come with everything he's got, and this place won't stand a chance." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Sarah muttered, her voice laced with sarcasm. Lila shrugged. I am just telling it like it is. You're outmatched, outgunned, and running on borrowed time. You need a backup plan. Ethan frowned, his mind already racing through their options. She wasn't Tidong. The sabotage had delayed the coalition as to advance, but it hadn't tie-stopped it. Sooner or later, Vicorta would regroup, and when he did, he'd come with enough force to wipe their village off the map. I'll figure something out, Ethan said, though. The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Lila raised an eyebrow. You better, because next time there won't be any tunnels to hide it. With that, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Ethan and Sarah standing alone near the barricade. Ethan watched her go, his jaw clenched. He didn't trust Lila. Not fully, but she had a point. If they didn't come up with a plan soon, everything they had fought for would be lost. As the village began to stir with the arrival of morning, Ethan made his way back to the small building that had once been his family. So it was barely recognizable now, just a skeleton of its former self, with most of the walls crumbling and the roof partially caved in. But it was still standing, and that was something. Inside, he found a few of the village chef's remaining fighters gathered around a makeshift table, discussing their next move. Their faces were etched with fatigue and worry, but they straightened up when Ethan entered the room. They looked to him for guidance, for leadership. He had become their de facto leader, though he had never asked for the role. We've bought ourselves some time, Ethan began, leaning against the edge of the table. But it's not going to be enough. The coalition will regroup, and when they do, they'll come at us harder than before. One of the older fighters, a grizzled man named Hank, nodded grimly. We figured as much. What's the plan? Ethan rubbed a hand over his face, trying to think. We need to fortify our defenses, set more traps. We'll use the sabotage to our advantage and make them pay for every inch they try to take. And what about the people? Sarah asked from the doorway, her voice soft but firm. We can just keep fighting. We need to think about evacuating. Hank shook his head. Evacuate to where there's nowhere to go. The whole world says in the same shape we are. If we leave this place, we'll be out there fighting for scraps with the rest of the scavengers. She said right, though. Another fighter, a younger man named Cole, chimed in. We can try to hold out forever. If the coalition gets their hands on that energy reserve, it's over for all of us. Ethan's mind whirled with conflicting thoughts. He knew they couldn't fight forever. The village's resources were stretched thin, and morale was at its breaking point. But he couldn't bring himself to accept defeat. Not yet. We were not evacuating, Ethan said finally, his voice firm. Not unless we absolutely have to. We will prepare for the worst, but we'll fight like hell to keep this place standing. We have something they want that gives us leverage. The fighters exchanged uncertain glances, but no one argued. They had followed Ethan this far, and for better or worse, they would follow him into the final battle. Hours passed in a blur of preparation. Ethan and the remaining fighters worked tirelessly to reinforce the barricades, setting traps in the fields surrounding the village and stockpiling what little ammunition they had left. The air was thick with tension, every breath feeling like it could be their last before the storm hit. As night fell once again, Ethan stood watch on the ridge overlooking the valley, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The village below him was eerily quiet, the people huddled in their homes, waiting for the inevitable. Lila appeared beside him, her footsteps as silent as ever. You really think you can win this? Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched the stars flicker faintly in the sky, wondering how many other villages were out there fighting their own desperate battles for survival. I have to believe we can, he said finally, otherwise. What's the point? Lila chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. That's the thing about hope. It has a dangerous weapon, cuts both ways. Ethan glanced at her, his brow furrowed. Why are you still here, Layla? You don't owe us anything. She shrugged, her expression unreadable. Maybe I am just curious to see how this all plays out. They stood in silence for a moment longer before Lila spoke again, her tone more serious. Victor one T stop. You know that, right? Even if you beat him here, he'll keep coming. People like him. They don't know how to quit. Ethan nodded. So what's the plan then? You gonna fight him forever? Ethan didn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know what the future held. All he knew was that he couldn't let Victor win. Not here, not now. The faint sound of engines echoed through the valley, and Ethan's pulse quickened. They were coming. The final battle was about to begin. Without a word, Ethan turned and headed back down the ridge, his heart pounding in his chest. The time for planning was over. Now it was all about survival. The engines grew louder, a constant hum that vibrated through the ground, signaling the approach of the Eastern Coalition. Ethan's heart thudded in sync with the noise, his body tense as he descended the ridge back to the village. The night sky had clouded over, dark and heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the coming storm. Down below the village was a hive of nervous activity. Fighters moved into their positions, checking weapons and adjusting barricades. Sarah was among them, distributing last-minute supplies and offering words of reassurance to the villagers who had taken shelter in the center of town. Most of them were too old or too young to fight, but their fear was palpable. They knew what was coming. Ethan found himself at Sarah's side, his hand resting on her shoulder as they stood together in the shadow of what was once their family home. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of determination and fear. "You ready for this?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded, though her voice trembled slightly, "As ready as I'll ever be." Ethan offered her a small strained smile. "We'll get through this, one way or another." He wasn't sure if he believed his own words, but there was no time for doubt. The sound of engines had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on the village like a heavy blanket. The coalition had arrived. Lila appeared beside them, her eyes scanning the horizon. They were close, she muttered, "Too close." Ethan could feel the weight of the moment settling over him, the crushing pressure of responsibility. His fingers tightened around the grip of his rifle, the cold metal grounding him in the chaos. "Everyone to your positions," he called out, his voice firm and steady, masking the dread that gnawed at his inside. The fighters scrambled into place, crouching behind barricades and taking cover in the ruins of the village. The night seemed to stretch on forever, as they waited every second, feeling like an eternity. And then, in the distance, a single flare shot into the sky, casting an unnatural light over the landscape. "They're recoming," Sarah whispered. The first wave of coalition soldiers swept across the valley like a tidal surge, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light. The heavy rumble of tanks followed, their hulking forms emerging from the shadows, cutting a path through the rubble. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat. This was it, the final battle. The village erupted in gunfire as the fighters opened fire, their bullets cutting through the air with a deafening roar. The coalition soldiers returned fire almost immediately, their well-trained forces advancing with terrifying precision. The sound of explosions filled the air as mortars and grenades tore through the barricades, sending clouds of dust and debris into the sky. Ethan moved with practiced efficiency, firing at the advancing soldiers and barking orders to his fighters. The village was a battlefield now, and every inch of ground was being contested with blood and sweat. He could see the tanks rolling in from the east, their cannons blasting through the barricades with ease. "Take out the tanks," Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse from the strain. Lila darted forward, her movements quick and calculated as she threw herself behind a pile of rubble, preparing to launch the explosives they had rigged earlier. Ethan fired at the approaching soldiers, covering her as she worked. The first tank rumbled closer, its cannon swiveling toward the heart of the village. "Now, Lila," Ethan yelled. Lila didn't hesitate. She triggered the detonator, and a series of explosions rocked the battlefield as the traps they had set went off in a chain reaction. The first tank was engulfed in flames, its massive frame crumpling under the force of the blast. A cheer rose from the fighters, but it was short-lived. More tanks were coming. Ethan ducked as a burst of gunfire peppered the ground around him, his heart racing. The coalition forces were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. He could see Vixorces, soldiers pushing forward, gaining ground, despite the resistance. The village was crumbling, their defenses falling apart with every passing minute. Beside him, Sarah fired her pistol with grim determination, her face pale but resolute. Ethan could see the strain in her eyes, the toll the battle was taking on her, but she didn't tie it back down. She wouldn't tongue knot when everything they had left was on the line. A sudden explosion rocked the ground near them, and Ethan was thrown off his feet, his vision spinning as he hit the dirt. His ears rang, and for a moment, everything went silent. He struggled to push himself up, his limbs heavy and uncomforted. When his vision cleared, he saw Sarah lying a few feet away, unmoving. "Sarah!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. He crawled toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. She wasn't moving. He reached her side and rolled her over, his hands trembling. Blood trickled down her temple, but she was breathing. Relief washed over him. like a tidal wave, but it was short-lived. The battle was closing in around them, and the village was falling. Ethan, Sarah murmured weakly, her eyes fluttering open. "We can try, hold them off. We have to go." Ethan shook his head, his jaw clenched. "Remember, I am not leaving you." "You have to," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the battle. "They'll kill us all. You need to get the others out." Ethan's throat tightened, his chest aching with the weight of her word. He knew she was right. The village was lost, and staying here would only mean more death. But the thought of leaving, of abandoning the place he had fought so hard to protect, was almost unbearable. Lila appeared at his side, her face grim. She said, "Right, Ethan? We're out of time. We need to get out of here before Vicator brings in the rest of his forces." Ethan's mind raced, torn between his instinct to fight and the reality of their situation. The battle had been brutal, and they had inflicted heavy losses on the Coalition, but it wasn't high enough. Vicator and T stop until every last one of them was dead. With a heavy heart, Ethan made his decision. He hoisted Sarah onto his back, wincing at the strain, and nodded to Lila. "We were pulling out." Lila's expression was unreadable, but she nodded. "I'll cover you get to the evac point." Ethan pushed forward, weaving through the chaos as the village continued to fall apart around him. He could hear the desperate cries of the fighters still holding the line, the sound of gunfire and explosions ringing in his ears. Every step felt like a betrayal, but he knew it was the only way. They reached the edge of the village where a few vehicles had been prepared for a potential evacuation. The remaining villagers, those too weak or injured to fight, were already being loaded into the makeshift convoy. Ethan placed Sarah into the back of one of the vehicles, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what they were leaving behind. "Get them out of here," Ethan said to the driver, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll hold them off as long as I can." The driver nodded, and the vehicles roared to life, speeding away from the doomed village. Ethan stood for a moment, watching them disappear into the distance. Then he turned back toward the battlefield, his rifle in hand. He knew what was coming. The Catarsaw forces were too strong, too many. But Ethan wasn't going to let them take his home without a fight. As the Coalition forces closed in, Ethan took his position behind the last standing barricade. His body was battered, his strength waning, but his resolve was unshaken. He fired at the approaching soldiers, his every shot a defiant act in the face of overwhelming odds. The tanks rumbled closer, and Ethan could see Vicator's forces advancing, their dark silhouettes moving like shadows across the battlefield. His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't back down. He would fight until his last breath. The ground shook as the tanks rolled over the barricades, and Ethan's rifle clicked empty. He was out of ammo. With a grim smile, he dropped the weapon and pulled his knife from its sheath. He had always known it would end like this, fighting, bleeding, protecting the people he loved. The first soldier came at him, and Ethan met him, head on, his blade flashing in the dim light. The fight was brutal, messy, and over too quickly, but there were more soldiers coming, and Ethan could feel the exhaustion creeping into his bones. As he fought, his thoughts drifted to Sarah, to the village, to the life they had once known before the world had gone to hell. He had fought so hard to protect them, to keep the last remnants of his home standing. But now, as the battle raged around him, he realized that some things couldn't be saved. Vicator's forces overwhelmed him, and Ethan was knocked to the ground, his vision blurring. He tried to push himself up, but his strength was gone. The world around him faded into darkness as the last remnants of his village fell. In the distance, the convoy carrying Sarah and the others disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind the smoldering remains of the village that had once been their home. Ethan's eyes fluttered closed, a final breath escaping his lips as the battle came to an end. The resource war was over. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The wind howled across the endless stretch of sand, a ghostly wail that seemed to echo from the remnants of a world long gone. The sun hung heavy and oppressive in the sky, its rays casting a molten glare over the barren dunes where only the strongest survived. Kai narrowed his eyes against the swirling dust, pulling the tattered scarf tighter around his face. His skin was bronze from years of desert exposure, muscles lean and hardened from relentless struggle. Each step he took sank into the shifting sands, but he pushed forward, his instincts guiding him towards something he wasn't sure existed. Rumors of an oasis, a hidden paradise buried deep within the dunes, had circulated for generations. Some called it a myth, the fever dream of those who had long since lost hope. But Kai believed he had to. His people, what was left of them, needed water, food, anything that could give them a fighting chance. His mind wandered to the small group of survivors back in the camp huddled around makeshift tent. The heat had already claimed so many. Even now, the sick and the weak clung to life, their lips cracked, their bodies frail without help. They wouldn't last much longer. Kai had heard of the verdant cradle as a child, a place where water bubbled from underground springs and trees bore fruit year-round. A place untouched by the desert, its merciless advance, and now standing on the precipice of what he hoped was real. He felt a strange pull, like the sands themselves were guiding him. He had been walking for days, his water supply dwindling dangerously low. His camel, a stubborn beast named Tariq, plodded along beside him, grunting its discontent. Kai patted the animal as that flanked absently, eyes scanning the horizon. The dunes seemed endless, rolling in waves as far as he could see. But then something shifted. In the distance, a small patch of green flickered, almost like a mirage. Kai blinked, convinced his eyes were playing tricks on him, but no, the green persisted, shimmering with promise. His heart leaped in his chest. This had to be it. He urged Tariq forward, his pace quickening despite the protest of his weary leg. As he neared, the details became clearer. Small bushes, their leaves vibrant against the dull backdrop of sand, appeared along the edges of a thin, winding stream. It wasn't much, but the sight of fresh water sent a surge of hope through his veins. Kai knelt by the stream, cupping his hands to bring the cool liquid to his parched lip. The water was sweet, like nothing he had tasted in years. He drank greedily, then refilled his canteen. Tariq, sensing the water as presence, bent down to drink beside him, snorting in satisfaction. But as Kai stood, the hair on the back of his neck bristled. Something was wrong. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent he hadn't noticed before. Smoke. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of his blade as he scanned the area. Shadows moved along the dunes, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the sand reached his ears. He wasn't alone. Before he could react, a sharp whistle cut through the air. An arrow struck the ground inches from his foot, and he spun just in time to see a group of men emerge from the dunes, their faces hidden behind tattered scarves. Their armor gleamed in the sunlight, but it was their symbol that sent a chill through Kai's senses. Bones, a jagged fang, etched into the metal, the Iron Fang Syndicate. They had found him. Without hesitation, Kai leaped behind a nearby rock for cover, his blade already drawn. The Iron Fang were no ordinary bandits. They were ruthless, organized, and well-equipped, notorious for seizing control of what little water remained in the region. They enslaved survivors, forcing them to dig for resources, trading human life for profit. "Come out, desert rat," a voice called, mocking in its tone. "We know you were there. Hand over the water and we might let you crawl back to whatever hole you came from." T.I.S. jaw clenched. He peeked around the rock, counting at least 6 of them. Too many for a direct confrontation. He needed to think. His fingers brushed the small pouch at his side, where he kept a handful of small explosives, just enough to cause a distraction. Or the voice continued, "We'll just kill you and take it anyway." The men moved closer, their weapons drawn. Kai's heart pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to remain calm. He couldn't let them take the oasis, not after he had come so far. Carefully, he pulled one of the explosives from his pouch, lit the fuse, and tossed it toward the nearest dune. The blast was deafening, sending sand and debris flying into the air. The men shouted in confusion, momentarily blinded by the explosion. Kai took his chance, slipping around the back of the rock and sprinting toward the oasis. His legs burned with effort, but he pushed himself harder, dodging arrows that whizzed past his head. He reached the edge of the oasis, diving behind a cluster of thick bushes, just as the Iron Fang regained their senses. They shouted to one another, spreading out to search for him. Kai's mind raced. He couldn't fight them head-on, but he knew the desert better than they did. If he could lead them away from the water, maybe he stood a chance. He reached for another explosive, but before he could light it, a hand clamped down on his wrist, pulling him back into the shadow. "Quiet," a voice whispered in his ear. They'll hear you. Kai's muscles tensed, ready to fight, but the voice wasn't too hostile. Slowly, he turned to see a woman crouched beside him, her face partially obscured by a veil. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the area for danger. "Who are you?" Kai hissed. "Leah," she replied, her voice low. "This is my home, and if you want to survive, you'll do as I say." Kai hesitated. The Iron Fang were closing in, their voices growing louder. He had no choice but to trust her. With a nod, he followed her deeper into the undergrowth, moving silently through the oasis. The foliage thickened as they went, masking their presence from the syndicate scout. Finally, they reached a hidden clearing where a small group of people had gathered, their expressions tense, but determined. "Who are these people?" Kai asked, glancing around. "We were the ones who kept this place hidden for generations," Leah said, pulling her veil down to reveal her face. "The verdant cradle isn't just a myth. It's real, and we're not gonna let the Iron Fang destroy it." Kaiteli's mind raced. He had found the oasis, but he had to expect it to find an entire community living here, thriving in secret. They looked ragged, their clothes patched and worn, but their eyes held a fierce resilience. These were survivors, just like him. "What's your plan?" Kai asked, his hand still resting on the hilt of his blade. Leah's eyes flicked toward the horizon, where the Iron Fang soldiers were still searching. "We fight," she said simply. "We've defended this place before, and we will do it again, but we can do it alone." Kai glanced at the people gathered around them. They were strong, but they were also vastly outnumbered. The Iron Fang had more men, better weapons, and the element of surprise. This wasn't gonna be an easy fight. "I'll help you," he said, his voice firm, "but we'll need more than just weapons. We'll need strategy and trap." Leah's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained hard. "Then you'd better start planning. They won. Tito. Wait long." Kai wasted no time. As Leah led him to a concealed shelter in the heart of the oasis, he immediately began formulating a plan. The Iron Fang would attack with brute force, and the oasis people couldn't hope to match them in open combat. But Kai knew the desert, the shifting sands, the unpredictable winds, and the hidden dangers that could become their ally. His mind raced as he thought about how they could use the environment to even the odd. Leah stood close by, watching him with a mix of curiosity and tension. "What do you need from us?" "We need to turn the oasis into a trap," Kai replied. "They will come in expecting an easy victory. We'll give them something else entirely." Leah raised an eyebrow. "You think we can beat them?" "I don't know," Kai admitted, "but we can make them regret ever coming here." He spent the next few hours with Leah and her people outlining his strategy. They would use the natural landscape of the oasis, the dense foliage, the hidden springs, the uneven ground to confuse and trap the Iron Fang soldiers. Kai instructed them on how to dig hidden pits along the paths, cover them with sand and palm fronds, and set up rudimentary explosives near key choke point. The traps wouldn't stop the Iron Fang, but they would slow them down, give them the upper hand in guerrilla warfare. Leah's people were surprisingly skilled. Many of them had survived harsh conditions before, and their knowledge of the land complemented Kai's expertise. The work was grueling, but they moved with a sense of urgency. Every moment counted. As night fell, the oasis was transformed into a battlefield. Kai could feel the tension building in the air, the anticipation of the coming conflict. He had been in plenty of battles before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about defending something precious, something worth fighting for. Leah found him sitting by the stream, sharpening his blade in the flickering light of a small campfire. "You've done a lot for us," she said softly, sitting down beside it. "I didn't have a choice," Kai replied, his voice gruff. "If the Iron Fang takes this place, they'll destroy it." She nodded, her gaze distant as she stared into the flames. "We've kept this place hidden for so long. It's hard to believe it. It's all coming to an end." Kai looked at her, seeing the weariness in her eyes, the weight of leadership pressing down on her. "It's still not the end," he said quietly. "Not yet." Leah smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You're a strange man, Kai, a warrior with hope." Kai snorted. "Hope's never done much for me. I just do what needs to be done." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the desert wind rustling through the leaves. Kai could feel the weight of the coming battle settling on his shoulder. He had seen too much bloodshed in his life, and the thought of more death weighed heavily on him. But there was no other way. The Iron Fang wouldn't stop until they had control, and Kai couldn't let that happen. At dawn, the attack came. The Iron Fang soldiers moved like a swarm, sweeping over the dunes toward the oasis. Their leader, General Ravik, stood tall at the forefront, his armored figure gleaming in the early morning light. Ravik was a monster of a man, known for his ruthlessness and his iron grip on the desert territory. He commanded fear and loyalty in equal measure, and his soldiers followed him without question. Kai watched from his vantage point in the trees, his heart pounding as the enemy forces closed in. He gave the signal, and the traps were sprung. Explosions ripped through the air, sending sand and debris flying. Several soldiers were thrown off their feet, while others fell into the hidden pit. Chaos erupted as the Iron Fangs struggled to regain their footing, their carefully planned assault thrown into disarray. Kai and the Oasis fighters struck hard and fast, using the element of surprise to their advantage. They moved through the trees like shadows, striking from all sides, then retreating before the enemy could retaliate. Arrows flew from the treetops, taking out soldiers one by one. The Iron Fang, disoriented and confused, stumbled into the traps, their numbers dwindling. But the syndicate was well-trained, and Ravik wasn't one to be easily defeated. He rallied his forces, regrouping them at the edge of the oasis. "Push forward," he roared, his voice booming over the sounds of battle. "Take them down." The fighting grew fiercer. Kai found himself in the thick of it, his blade flashing as he took down one soldier after another. The heat of battle surged through his veins, sharpening his focus. But as skilled as he was, even he couldn't all hold off the Iron Fang forever. Their sheer numbers began to overwhelm the Oasis defenders, and slowly the tide of battle turned against them. Leah fought beside him, her movements graceful and deadly. She wielded a long staff, striking down enemies with precision. Together they fought their way toward Ravik, knowing that the only way to win was to cut off the head of the snake. Ravik spotted them coming and grinned, raising his massive battle axe. "You think you can take me?" he growled, his voice dripping with arrogance. Kai didn't respond. He launched himself at Ravik, his blade clashing against the warlord's axe with a deafening clang. The force of the blow nearly knocked Kai off his feet, but he held his ground, muscles straining as he pushed back. Ravik was stronger than anyone Kai had ever faced, but Kai was faster, more agile. He ducked under another swing of the axe, slashing at Ravik's exposed side. The warlord let out a roar of pain, but didn't he slow. He swung again, forcing Kai to dodge and roll out of the way. Leah circled around, trying to get an opening, but Ravik's movements were too fast, too unpredictable. The battle raged on around them, but in that moment, it was just Shiai and Ravik locked in a deadly dance. Kai could feel his strength waning, his movement slowing. He needed to end this and fast. With a final burst of energy, Kai darted forward, ducking under Ravik's swing and driving his blade deep into the warlord's chest. Ravik's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. Then with a guttural gasp, the warlord collapsed, his axe slipping from his grasp. The moment Ravik fell, the remaining Iron Fang soldiers hesitated, their leader, Fei, death shaking their resolve. Leah took the opportunity to rally the Oasis defenders, and together they launched a final decisive strike. The Iron Fang, leaderless and disorganized, fell back, retreating into the desert. As the dust settled and the sounds of battle faded, Kai stood over Ravik, spotty, breathing heavily. The adrenaline still pulsed through his veins, but the battle was over. They had won against all odds. They had defended the Oasis. Leah approached him, her staff still in hand, though. Her expression was softer now. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Kai wiped the sweat from his brow, staring down at the warlord's still lifeless form. "We did it." The Oasis was safe for now, but as Kai looked out over the blood-soaked sands, he knew this wasn't the end. The desert would always be dangerous, and new threats would rise. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar: hope. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The world was dying. Alex Carter stood on the edge of a vast desert, once a fertile valley. The blistering sun hung motionless in a cloudless sky, baking the cracked earth beneath his boot. This land had once been teeming with life, with crops stretching for miles, irrigated by rivers that no longer flowed. Now the wind carried only dust, and the air was thick with the smell of burning. It was a sight that haunted him, a reminder of how far humanity had fallen, how close they were to the brink. He pulled his visor down to shield his eyes from the harsh glare and turned away. He couldn't linger any longer. There was work to be done. The world's hottest energy crisis had come swiftly, like a storm that no one had prepared for. Fossil fuels, long relied upon, had been depleted. Wind and solar power hadn't been enough to keep pace with the demands of an ever-growing population. The oceans were poisoned, nuclear power considered too dangerous, and governments had been too slow to adapt. But humanity, ever resourceful, had found a solution. The artificial Sunday, a vast space-based solar energy system capable of capturing the sun, Ceres, and transferring the energy back to Earth. It had been a marvel of human ingenuity, a lifeline in a darkening future. Alex had been part of the original engineering team, working night and day to bring the system online, and had worked for a time. Then, without warning, the artificial Sunday exploded. The shockwave had disrupted the entire planet's delicate climate balance, causing temperatures to fluctuate wildly. Crops failed. Cities flooded. The worst of it, however, was the realization that the artificial Sunday hadn't failed on its own. Something or someone had tampered with it. Alex had watched from a distance as the world plunged into chaos, the same chaos he had worked so hard to prevent. Now, with the Earth's leaders panicking, they had called him back. He was supposed to fix the mess. But could it be fixed? He pulled out his communicator as the wind howled through the empty valley. Carter to command, I am ready for transport. Copy that, Carter, a voice crackled through his earpiece. We'll have you back at base in 10 minutes. Alex sighed, glancing at the dark horizon. 10 minutes felt like a lifetime. Every second wasted here was another step closer to total environmental collapse. The shuttle arrived in a roar of engine noise, kicking up dust as it landed. Alex climbed aboard, finding his seat beside Commander Maria Vega. She didn't smile. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said, her voice clipped. I've seen worse, Alex replied, strapping himself in. He didn't bother with small talk. There was no time. Maria nodded, tapping at her console to confirm their departure. She was a capable leader, Alex knew that much, tough, unflinching, and focused. It was no wonder the global leaders had chosen her to lead the mission's security team. But even Maria couldn't fully mask the concerns into her sharp features. They were both fully aware of the stake. As the shuttle rose into the sky, Alex's thoughts drifted to his team. In just a few hours, they'd be launching into space, heading toward the shattered remains of the artificial Sunday. The mission was clear: repair it before the world. Then climate spiraled beyond the point of no return. But the closer they got to launch, the more Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The briefing room aboard the EO's, their designated spacecraft, was cramped, buzzing with the hum of old machinery and the scent of antiseptic. Alex stood at the head of the table, eyeing his team. They were the best humanity had left to offer, and each of them knew it. Dr. Ella Quinn sat directly across from him, her gaze hard, her arms crossed. She had been his partner once, a brilliant astrophysicist, with a mind sharp enough to cut through the most complex of problems. Their history was complicated, fraught with unresolved tension, professional disagreements, and a shared guilt over the death of a mutual colleague. Wanted to work with him. Much was clear. Beside her was Raj Patel, the youngest member of the team and a rising star in systems engineering. He was nervous, always fidgeting with his tools or data pads, but there was no denying his genius when it came to computer systems. Alex had chosen him for a reason. Raj knew the ins and outs of the artificial Sunday systems better than anyone. Finally, Maria Vega stood in the back of the room, arms behind her back, every bit the military professional. Her role was simple: keep them alive. But in space, nothing was ever simple. Alex took a breath and began. We all know why we here. The artificial Sunday exploded, and Earth's climate is hanging by a thread. We don't have time for failure. If we don't fix this, every single person on this planet will be facing extinction. Elara shifted in her seat, her eyes boring into him. I assume you have a plan. Alex nodded. We're going to reach the remains of the artificial Sunday, assess the damage, and start repairs. We have to stabilize the reactor core. First, if that goes. It's on override. I'll need you on that immediately. Raj nodded, though. His expression was tense. Ilara, once we stabilize the core, I need you to work on rerouting the energy grid. We'll have to rebuild it from scratch. The energy transfer systems are completely fried. Ilara raised an eyebrow, and if the core can't be stabilized. Alex clenched his jaw. Then we improvise, but we will stabilize it. She didn't look convinced. You don't seem to understand. This isn't just about patching up a few wires. The core is likely in a state of flux. If it's unstable, the whole thing could blow again, taking us with it. We won't even let it get to that point, Alex said, his voice firm. Maria stepped forward. We'll keep security tight. I don't want any surprises out there. Good, Alex said, because if we rewrite, this wasn't an accident. Someone did this. They launched at dawn. The yo-yos broke through Earth's atmosphere, leaving behind the fractured blue and green sphere that was slowly being consumed by environmental chaos. Inside the ship, the tension was palpable. Alex watched the Earth shrink below them from the viewport, his mind racing through the countless possibilities of what they might find up there. In the distance, the artificial Sunday loomed its once brilliant surface, now marred by debris and jagged pieces of metal drifting aimlessly. It was a graveyard in space, the remains of humanity, its most ambitious project now a floating symbol of their desperation. Pass a mess out here's a key. Maria's team prepared for the spacewalk, her soldiers checking their suits and equipment with a precision that Alex couldn't help but admire. They were trained for the worst, but this mission was pushing the boundaries of even their experience. Brace for impact, Maria warned, just as a large chunk of debris scraped against the side of the U. The ship rattled, but held steady. Nice and easy, Alex muttered under his breath, watching the display screen in front of him. They were getting closer. As they reached the remains of the artificial Sunday, Alex could see the full extent of the destruction. The core reactor was a mess of twisted metal and shattered glass panels. The delicate wiring that once transmitted the sun's energy to Earth was nothing more than a tangled web of destruction. Raj's voice came through again. I don't know, boss, this looks worse than I thought. Alex gripped the console. We'll make it work. We don't have a choice. Alara's voice joined the conversation, calm but edged with concern. We were going to need to get a closer look. I'll head out with the team. Alex hesitated, but he knew there was no other way. Be careful out there. The airlock hissed open as Maria led her team out into the black void of space, Alara close behind. Alex watched through the viewport as they drifted toward the remains of the core reactor, the once glowing structure now dark and ominous. Approaching the core, Alara reported, we'll start the scan. Alex felt the weight of responsibility press down on him. If they couldn't destabilize the core, Earth was doomed. There was no margin for error, no time for second guessing. Then came the sound he'd been dreading. Alara's voice crackled through the intercom, barely concealing her alarm. There's something wrong. This wasn't just an accident. Someone sabotaged the reactor. Alex's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed sent a cold wave of fear through him. Sabotage? Raj asked, his voice incredulous. Alara's next words chilled them all. If we don't fix this fast, the artificial Sunday is going to go critical again. And this time, we won't be able to stop it. Alex's mind raced. Sabotage, he had known something was wrong. But to have his worst fears confirmed like this was a gut punch. His thoughts briefly flicked back to Earth already ravaged by the first explosion. If they failed again, there would be nothing left to say. Run the scans, he said, forcing himself to remain calm. Figure out how deep the damage goes. We'll need to prioritize the core stabilization first. Outside the viewport, Alara and Maria worked with the rest of the team, maneuvering around the ruined structure of the artificial Sunday. Alara's scanner beeped as she brought it close to the core surface. This isn't too good, Alara's voice crackled through the comm. I am seeing evidence of a foreign device attached to the reactor as primary energy regulator. It's small, but it looks like it's designed to destabilize the core. How long do we have before the reactor becomes unstable again? Alara's pause on the comm was too long for comfort. Not long. Raj, Alex barked. I need you to analyze those readings. If Alara says, right, we were looking at deliberate sabotage, there must be a way to disable whatever device is in there without triggering another explosion. I am on it, Raj replied, the sound of frantic typing coming through. But if this thing is as sophisticated as it looks, we might be cutting it really close. One wrong move could blow the whole thing again. Just find me a solution, Alex ordered, feeling the sweat bead on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the cabin. Maria's voice cut through conscious. Alex, I am sending 2 of my men to help stabilize the core housing while Illyra and I focus on removing the foreign device. We'll need to be precise, no room for error. Agreed, Alex said, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over him. This was it. They either fixed the artificial Sunday or watched Earth's saddest hope burn out in the cold of space. Let she do it. The minutes dragged on as Elara and Maria worked outside the ship, their movements precise and methodical, despite the danger looming over their every action. Alex monitored their progress, fingers tight around the edge of the console. Raj was muttering to himself, deep in concentration, but Alex's thoughts were elsewhere, turning over every possibility, every outcome, every failure that could still happen. Then Raj spoke up. "I've got something," he said, his voice tense. "If we reroute the secondary power lines away from the core housing, we can isolate the foreign device. But it's going to take some serious manual rewiring. Elara, you'll need to bypass the primary feed directly. Do you think you can handle that?" "I'll make it work," Elara replied. "Just guide me through it." Raj started feeding instructions, his voice steady but the underlying tension clear. Alex watched through the viewport, feeling utterly helpless as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every second counted. "I'm almost there," Elara said, her breathing heavy over the comms. "Just a few more connections to go." And then a loud crack echoed through the comms, followed by a short scream. Alex's heart lurched into his throat. "What happened?" Elara Maria shouted. Elara has been hit, her tether snapped. She's drifted. "Get her back," Alex barked, panic rising in his chest. His eyes frantically scanned the exterior, searching for a glimpse of Elara's suit as it drifted away from the reactor. The others scrambled into action, but space offered no mercy. Without her tether, Elara was drifting farther and farther into the void. "Maria," Alex said, struggling to keep his voice calm, "I need you to get Elara back inside now." Maria didn't hesitate on it. She signaled her men, and two of them immediately launched toward Elara's last known position. "Keep her steady, keep her in view," Maria's sass voice directed the crew as they carefully maneuvered. Alex could only watch helplessly as the two soldiers rocketed toward Elara, jetting through space with precision. Seconds ticked by like hours as they caught up to her and grabbed her suit, pulling her back toward the ship. Relief washed over Alex as he saw her tethered back safely to the EO. "I've got her," one of Maria's soldiers confirmed, their voices steady over the comm. "Elara, are you okay?" Alex asked. "I'm fine," she grunted, her voice shaky but determined. "Just get this over with." They pulled her back to the core reactor, but now every second felt heavier, every movement fraught with the looming threat of failure. Finally, Elara's voice cut through the tension once more. "Raj, I've bypassed the primary feed. You should have control of the secondary lines now." Alex exhaled. Their fingers flew over the controls. "All right, we're rerouting the power flow. Now it's working. The core is stabilizing, but we were still not out of the wood. I'll need another half hour to secure the grid before we can bring the full system back online." "Keep at it," Alex said, his voice steadying. "We're almost there." As the team continued their repairs, Alex felt a glimmer of hope, but it was short-lived. A sudden warning alarm blared across the control room. "What now?" he muttered under his breath, rushing to the console to check the reading. Raj's voice echoed his dread. "There's a power surge in the reactor. The sabotage it has triggered an automatic feedback loop. If we don't shut it down now, the reactor's going to overload again." Alex's mind raced. Option. Raj didn't even hesitate. Manual override. Someone has to get inside the core and shut it down. From there, it's the only way to stop the feedback. Alex felt a chill run down his spine. Entering the core meant risking exposure to lethal radiation, and even with the protective suits, there was no guarantee of survival. But without someone inside, Earth didn't stand a chance. "I'll do it," Raj said, standing up from his station. Alex looked at him in surprise. "Raj, no, you're too valuable out here." Raj shook his head. "I am the only one who knows the systems well enough to pull this off. Besides, I have something to make up for." Alex brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Raj hesitated. "I wasn't just hired for my expertise, Alex. He swallowed hard. They blackmailed me. The people who sabotaged the artificial Sunday, they threatened my family. And you were involved," Alex whispered, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. "You helped them." Raj lowered his head in shame. "I didn't know it would be this bad. I swear I didn't. But now I have to make it right. Let me do this." There was a heavy silence in the room as Alex weighed the decision. He should have been furious, should have dragged Raj off the mission and handed him over for justice. But they didn't have time for that. They needed Raj. Earth needed Raj. So Alex said, "Finally, but make sure you come back." Raj nodded and suited up. The team watched in silence as he entered the airlock, stepping out into the cold void of space. He was just a tiny figure against the massive bulk of the artificial Sunday as he made his way toward the core. The next few minutes were agonizing. Alex watched the readouts closely, tracking Raj's progress as he entered the core chamber. Raj's breathing came through the comms, heavy and uneven as he worked. "I am at the control panel," Raj said, his voice strained, beginning the manual override sequence. Now, Alex held his breath. "I am rerouting the final power lines." Raj's voice trailed off, and for a moment, all they could hear was static. Then the feedback loop is stopped. "The core is stabilizing." Alex exhaled, relief flooding through him. But just as quickly, Raj's voice crackled again. "Alex, I don't think I am going to make it out of here. The radiation's too strong." "No," Alex said, his voice tight. "We'll get you out. Just hang on." Raj's voice was fading it. "It's okay. I made my choice. Tell them I am sorry." And then the line went dead. Alex closed his eyes, his chest tight with grief. He hadn't been able to save Raj, but the mission was complete. The artificial Sunday was stabilized. Earth had a fighting chance. Maria's voice broke the silence. "The system's holding. We ready to head back?" Alex opened his eyes, forcing himself to focus. "Good, let's go home." They gathered the remaining crew and made their way back to the EO. Alex took one last look at the artificial Sunday through the viewport as the ship pulled away. It was no longer a beacon of hope, but it wasn't a symbol of destruction either. It was something in between, a fragile reminder of humanity's desperate will to survive. As they entered Earth as atmosphere, Alex couldn't help but feel the weight of all they had lost. But he knew one thing for sure: they had given Earth a chance, and sometimes that was enough. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The world had changed overnight. What was once a vibrant city now lay submerged beneath the relentless tide. Buildings that had once touched the sky now stood half submerged like forgotten monuments of a lost civilization. The streets, once full of bustling life, were now underwater canyons home to creatures that lurked in the deep. Jake Reynolds floated on the surface, his breathing slow and measured through the regulator in his mouth. The cold Atlantic currents tugged at his wetsuit as though the ocean itself was eager to pull him down to the sunken streets below. He scanned the horizon, looking for a glimpse of something familiar amidst the towering wave. His mind flashed back to the day it all began. The news had been full of warnings: melting ice caps, tectonic shifts, sea levels rising. But no one had anticipated the scale of what came next. The tsunami had arrived without mercy, swallowing coastal cities whole. Jake had been on the shore when it hit, his family only blocks away at their apartment. He had tried to get to them, but the floodwaters swept him away before he could reach Lena and Emily. Now, all that remained of the life he once knew was hidden beneath the waves, and somewhere in those drowned streets, his family was lost. Jake adjusted his dive mask and rolled backward into the water, plunging into the dark, cold depth. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained focused. He couldn't afford fear, not now. The underwater city was a maze of broken streets and fallen debris. Cars were half buried in sediment and shattered glass floated like confetti. Jake swam through the ruins of what was once downtown, weaving through the wreckage as he descended deeper. His oxygen gauge flickered in the corner of his vision, 3/4 full. He had time, but not enough to waste. He swam past the collapsed skeleton of a high-rise where shadows moved among the wreckage. His pulse quickened as he recognized the shaped schools of fish, larger than they used to be, their slick, muscular bodies darting in and out of the submerged ruin. They weren't the only things lurking here. The ocean had changed, too. Suddenly, a dark shape flickered in his peripheral vision. Jake froze, gripping his spear gun tightly. His eyes strained to see through the murky water, but there was nothing, just his mind playing tricks on him. He couldn't afford to be paranoid. He had a mission, and he wasn't going to let fear distract him. But the silence of the ocean was deceptive. He swam deeper into the city, passing what used to be his neighborhood, now a sunken wasteland. His heart clenched as he saw the familiar landmarks: the grocery store where he and Lena would shop every Sunday, the park where he pushed Emily on the swing. All of it was submerged, and worse, it was deserted. There were no signs of life. A glimmer caught his eye. Jake swam toward it, his heart leaping in his chest. It was a car half submerged, the headlights still faintly glowing in the depth. Inside, he saw movement, a hand, no, a glove, drifting like it had been abandoned. His heart sank as he realized it wasn't his family. Scoff. Suddenly, something slammed into him from behind. He spun, raising his spear gun as a massive, mutated fish lunged at him, its teeth bare. Jake fired instinctively, the spear slicing through the water and embedding itself in the creature's side. It thrashed wildly, but Jake kicked back, avoiding its gnashing jaws. Blood billowed in the water as the fish convulsed, its life draining away. Jake took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. The ocean was teeming with these monsters now, animals driven mad by the pollution, the sudden changes in their habitat. He couldn't let his guard down, not even for a second. He pressed onward, swimming through the crumbling remains of his neighborhood. The apartment building where he'd last seen Lena and Emily loomed ahead, its structure twisted and broken by the force of the tsunami. Jake's heart raced as he swam through the shattered windows and into the building. The inside was a nightmare. Furniture floated in the flooded halls, and debris clogged every corner. He navigated the dark corridors, his eyes scanning for any sign of life. Every inch of this place held memories, his daughter, his laughter, his wife, smile. He had to find them. They had to be here. Suddenly, he heard a noise, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. Jake froze, his heart pounding. Was it a survivor? He followed the sound, moving deeper into the building. His flashlight beam flickered across the water, illuminating the eerie emptiness of the sunken apartment complex. Then he saw a message scratched into the wall, "Safe at the marina." The words were crude but clear. Jake's heart soared with hope. Lena had been here. She and Emily had made it out. He wasn't too late. He swam out of the building, heading toward the marina at the edge of the city. The journey was treacherous, the streets below swarming with sea life, some of it large enough to take him down if he wasn't too careful, but nothing would stop him now. As he approached the marina, Jake noticed something strange. The water here was darker, more turbulent. His instincts told him something was wrong, but he pushed forward, determined to find his family. He swam through the remains of the harbor, his eyes scanning for any sign of life. Then he saw a group of survivors huddled on a floating platform, makeshift tents set up between the remains of old boats. Relief washed over him as he kicked toward them, desperate to see Lena and Emily among them. But as he got closer, he realized something was off. The survivors weren't tree welcoming, they were armed. "Stop right there." A voice called out. A man, tall and muscular, emerged from the group holding a rusted rifle aimed directly at Jake. His eyes were cold, hardened by weeks of survival in this new world. "I am just looking for my family," Jake said, his voice muffled through the mask. He raised his hands, showing he wasn't a threat. "My wife and daughter, Lena and Emily. Have you seen them?" The man didn't lower his rifle. "There's no room for new people here," he said, his voice flat. "We've got enough problems without taking in stray." Jake's heart sank. These weren't the kind of survivors he was hoping to find. "Please," he said, his voice desperate. "I am not looking for a fight. I just need to know if they were here." The man stared at him for a long moment, then finally lowered his rifle. "They were here," he said, "a woman and a little girl, but they left, headed north with another group." Jake felt a surge of relief mixed with dread. They were alive, but they were still out there somewhere in the vast, dangerous waters of the drowned world, and he wasn't the only one searching for them. Before he could ask more questions, the man nodded to his group, and Jake felt hands grab him from behind. He struggled, but they were too strong. The next thing he knew, he was being dragged into the marina, some murky depths, his gear stripped away as he was thrown into a half-submerged cave. The last thing he saw before the water closed over his head was the cold, emotionless stare of the man with the rifle. Jake thrashed in the water, the taste of salt and metal filling his mouth as he struggled against the cage. The cold metal bars pressed into his skin, and the weight of his soaked gear made it hard to keep his head above water. His captors didn't speak a word as they secured the cage to a broken pier, leaving him submerged up to his neck in the freezing water. He could hear their footsteps fading as they walked away, their voices murmuring as they blended back into the group. Jake forced himself to stay calm, his breath shallow as his mind raced. This was not how he'd imagined his search for Lena and Emily would go, but panic wouldn't help. He surveyed the cage, rusted but sturdy, and ran his fingers along the worn metal, searching for a weakness. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept moving, feeling along the bars for any opening, any chance to escape. There wasn't very much time he had to get out before they came back. The marina was quiet, the gentle sound of waves lapping against the platform above. But below, the world was anything but calm. Dark shapes flickered in the water beneath him, and he could feel the current pulling against the cape. The ocean had become a living, breathing entity full of things that thrived in the chaos left behind by the flood. His fingers scraped against a sharp edge. One of the bars had corroded, just enough to give way if he could apply pressure in the right spot. Jake kicked his legs against the floor of the cage, pushing with his feet to bend the weakened bar outward. It moved slightly, just enough to give him hope. He pressed harder, feeling it give a little more with each push. Suddenly, the surface above rippled, and Jake froze. He watched as a shadow passed overhead, dark and deliberate. Something large was circling the marina, its presence barely noticeable in the low light. His heart thudded as he listened for the sounds of his captors, hoping they hadn't noticed the disturbance. A low growl echoed through the water, vibrating through the cage. Whatever it was close. Too close for comfort. Jake redoubled his efforts, pushing against the bar with every ounce of strength he had left. The weakened metal bent further, and with one final shove, it snapped free. Jake wasted no time. He squeezed through the narrow opening, his body scraping against the jagged metal as he pulled himself out. He hit the water, diving deep to avoid being seen, his lungs burning as he swam away from the marina. The cold water numbed his limbs, but the adrenaline kept him moving. He surfaced silently, just far enough from the platform to avoid detection. His eyes scanned the area. The survivors hadn't noticed his escape yet, but they would soon. He couldn't linger. He needed to find a way out, a way to continue his search for Lena and Emily before it was too late. The marina stretched into the flooded city, half-submerged boats and debris littering the area. Jake spotted a small skiff bobbing in the water, abandoned but intact. He swam toward it, pulling himself aboard and cutting the rope that tethered it to the dock. His hands shook from the cold, but he managed to work quickly, loosening the boat from its moorings and pushing it into the open water. The boat drifted quietly as Jake paddled with what remained of his strength. He couldn't risk starting the engine. Too much noise would attract attention, both from the survivors and whatever else lurked beneath the surface. He needed to disappear, to vanish into the city's flooded ruins and continue his search alone. The hours passed in a blur as Jake navigated through the sunken city, his eyes scanning the water for any sign of life. The devastation was endless buildings reduced to skeletal remains, streets buried beneath the ocean, set depth, and everywhere the creatures mutated deadly, watching from the shadow. His thoughts kept returning to Lena and Emily, their faces flickering in his mind like a beacon of hope. They had survived, he was sure of it, but every hour that passed made the distance between them seem wider, more impossible to bridge. As dusk fell, Jake spotted movement on the horizon, a flicker of light barely visible through the haze. He squinted, focusing on the distant silhouette. It was a group of people moving between two partially submerged buildings. They were carrying something large, crates stacked on makeshift raft. His heart raced. It had to be them. Lena and Emily could be with that group moving through the city under cover of darkness. Jake paddled closer, careful to stay out of sight. The group was quiet, working quickly to load the crates onto a larger vessel moored nearby. It wasn't TA gang or hostile faction. These were survivors like him. But something felt off. The air around them was tense, like they were on the run. He watched for a few moments, debating whether to approach. He had no guarantee that Lena and Emily were with them, but he couldn't afford to ignore any chance of finding them. He steered the boat toward the group, his hands gripping the sides as he prepared to speak. But before he could make his move, a loud crack echoed through the city. The group scattered, diving for cover as a spray of gunfire erupted from the shadow. Jake ducked, his heart pounding as bullets ricocheted off the water. Someone was attacking the survivor. He turned to see a group of heavily armed figures emerging from the ruins, their faces obscured by masks. They moved with military precision, sweeping through the area with brutal efficiency. The survivors were outnumbered, their makeshift weapons no match for the attackers' firepower. Jake's instincts kicked in, and he paddled away from the scene as quickly as possible. This wasn't his fight. He couldn't afford to get involved, but as he turned to flee, he caught a glimpse of something, a flash of blonde hair, a familiar figure being dragged toward the attackers' boat. Lena. Jake's blood ran cold. He couldn't see Emily, But Lena was there, struggling against her captors as they hauled her aboard. The attackers worked quickly, securing the survivors to the boat and preparing to leave. They weren't killing them. They were taking them somewhere. Without thinking, Jake turned the skiff toward the attackers' vessel, paddling as hard as he could. His mind raced, searching for a plan. He couldn't take on the armed group alone, but he had to do something. He had come too far to lose her now. As he neared the boat, Jake spotted a stack of fuel drums lashed to the side. It was a long shot, but if he could cause a distraction, he might have a chance to get Lena out. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small flare. It was risky if he missed. The entire boat could go up in flames, taking Lena and the others with it, but he didn't have a choice. With a deep breath, Jake aimed the flare at the fuel drums and fired. The flare hit its mark, igniting the drums with a deafening explosion. The attackers scattered, shouting in panic as the fire spread across the deck. Jake used the chaos to his advantage, paddling alongside the boat and pulling himself aboard. He moved quickly, dodging between the flames as he searched for Lena. The heat was intense, the air thick with smoke, but he pushed forward, his eyes scanning the deck for any sign of her. They're tied to the railing, struggling to free herself. Jake sprinted toward her, his heart pounding as he cut through the ropes with a knife. Lena gasped as she saw him, her eyes wide with shock and relief. "Jake, you alive?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "I am getting you out of here," he said, pulling her to her feet where sat Emily. Lena's face fell, her expression one of terror and heartbreak. They took her. She sent with the others on the second boat. Jake's stomach dropped. Emily was still out there in the hands of the attacker. The boat was already pulling away, disappearing into the darkness as the flames consumed the wreckage behind them. Jake tightened his grip on Lena and Nasser, and his mind racing. He couldn't lose them both. He had to find Emily no matter what it took. "I am going after her," he said, his voice firm. "We were getting our family back." Together, they jumped from the burning boat into the dark, cold waters below. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The ground shook beneath Ethan Keller's boots as he stared out through the thick window, past the layers of reinforced steel and plastic that separated him from the nightmare outside. His breath fogged a glass as he exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the frozen wasteland beyond. What was once a bustling metropolis now lay in ruins, the streets buried under layers of ash and ice, the skyline fractured and jagged against the gray, sunless sky. The nuclear war had ended over a year ago, but the Earth hadn't recovered. Dust clouds filled with radioactive particles still hung in the atmosphere, choking out the sun's warmth and casting the planet into an eternal winter. Humanity, or what was left of it, had retreated underground, hiding like rats from the cold and radiation. The bunker had been designed to last a few months at most, but here they were 1 year later, clinging to life. Ethan pressed a hand against the window, his rough palm sliding down the cold surface. Supplies were running low, food, water, medicine. All of it was dwindling, and their filtration systems were on the verge of collapse. He knew what that meant. They'd have to return to the surface sooner or later. It wasn't just the mutants that scared him. It was the radiation, the cold, the uncertainty of what they'd find up there. A knock on the metal door behind him made him turn. Dr. Nadia Harper stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her face set in that familiar scowl. Her long, dark hair was tied back and her sharp eyes met his. "They're waiting for you in the central hall," she said. "We need to make a decision." He sighed and nodded, his hand dropping to his side. "I know." He turned to face her, fully brushing past her as he left the room. "How bad is it?" Dr. Harper followed him down the narrow corridor, their footsteps echoing off the steel wall. "Bad, the air filters won't hold out much longer, and we're running out of antibiotics. If anyone gets sick now, there's nothing we can do." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We need to go up, down T. That's what we'll have to discuss," she replied. Not everyone agreed. "Finn Jacobs, I am guessing," Ethan muttered under his breath. "Among others," Dr. Harper confirmed. "He's got a following now. People are scared, and scared people will follow anyone who promises them hope." Ethan nodded, his mind already on the coming confrontation. Finn Jacobs, an engineer who had been with them since the early days, had been pushing for more aggressive action, leading expeditions to the surface, risking more lives to find supplies, maybe even searching for other survivors. Finn had a point, but he also had no idea what was waiting for them outside. They reached the central hall, a large room carved out of the bedrock that housed the remnants of their community. The survivors, all 47 of them, were gathered there, huddled together under dim lights that flickered intermittently as the power grid struggled to maintain stability. The air smelled of sweat and fear. Finn stood near the center, surrounded by a small group of his supporters, his arms gesturing wildly as he spoke. "We can stay down here any longer," Finn was saying as Ethan and Dr. Harper approached. "We're running out of time. We either go up and take our chances, or we wait down here and die slowly." Ethan cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. All eyes turned to him. "I understand your concerns," he began, his voice steady, "but going up to the surface isn't a decision we can make lightly. The radiation levels are still high, and we don't know what's out there. Mutants," Finn interrupted, scoffing. "Women have been hiding from shadows for too long. If there are mutants, we deal with them. We can truly live in fear forever." Ethan felt a surge of frustration. This isn't about fear. It's not about survival. "We've managed to stay alive this long because we've been cautious. If we rush into this, we'll lose more lives, let me say." Finn took a step closer, his voice rising. "If we don't do something now, there won't be any lives left to lose." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Ethan scanned the faces of the people he had sworn to protect. Fear was etched into their expressions, but so was desperation. They were looking to him for answers, but even he wasn't sure what the right answer was anymore. Dr. Harper stepped forward, breaking the tension. "Look, we can't afford to sit on our hands, but we also can't afford to be reckless. I am proposing a compromise, a small scouting mission, just a few people. We assess the situation, gather what information we can, and report back. Then we decide on the next course of action." Finn's expression softened slightly, though. Ethan could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. "Fine," Finn said after a moment, "but it needs to happen soon." "It will," Ethan promised. "I'll lead the team myself." There were no objections, though. Ethan could feel the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. He wasn't too afraid of what they'd find on the surface. He was afraid of the choices he'd have to make once they got there. The cold hit Ethan like a physical blow the moment they stepped onto the surface. The temperature must have been well below freezing, and the air was thick with ash and dust. He pulled his scarf tighter around his face and glanced back at the others. Dr. Harper, Alex, and 2 other volunteers, a man named Greg and a woman named Lucy, were all bundled up in layers of makeshift winter gear, their faces hidden behind protective masks. The landscape was a twisted nightmare of ice and ruin. Buildings stood half collapsed, their skeletal frames jutting out of the snow like tombstones. The sky was a perpetual gray, and the sun, if it was there at all, was a distant memory. Nothing moved, nothing lived, at least not yet. Ethan led them forward, his boots crunching in the snow. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the world itself was pressing down on him. They barely got a mile from the entrance to the bunker when they heard the first sound, a low growl, almost imperceptible beneath the howling wind. Ethan stopped in his tracks, holding up a hand to signal the others to do the same. His heart raced as he scanned the area, his breath coming in short, visible bursts. "There," Alex whispered, pointing toward a collapsed building to their right. Ethan squinted, his eyes narrowing against the cold. At first, he saw nothing. Then movement, a shadow darting between the rubble. It was too fast for him to make out clearly, but he knew what it was, a mutant. "Stay close," Ethan said, his voice barely audible over the wind, "and be ready to run." They continued cautiously, each step deliberate, each breath measured. The growling grew louder, more distinct. Whatever was out there, it wasn't T alone. Suddenly, the mutant charged from the shadows, a grotesque figure, once human, now barely recognizable. Its flesh was twisted and deformed, its eyes glowing a sickly green, its body covered in patches of melted skin and bone. It moved with terrifying speed, its claws outstretched as it lunged at them. Ethan reacted instinctively, raising his rifle and firing. The bullet struck the mutant in the chest, but it didn't stop. It staggered back, but only for a moment before launching itself forward again. Ethan fired again, this time hitting it square in the head. The mutant crumpled to the ground, its body twitching as it lay still. Dr. Harper knelt beside the body, her eyes wide with fascination. "Incredible," she murmured. "Its regeneration rate must be off the charts. It took 2 headshots to take it down." "This isn't the time for a science lesson," Ethan snapped, pulling her away. There's more of them out here. We need to move. They pushed forward, but the encounter had rattled them. Every shadow seemed to hide another threat. Every sound a harbinger of danger. As they reached the ruins of what had once been a grocery store, Ethan signaled for the group to take cover inside. Alex, his face flushed with excitement, leaned against the wall beside his father. That was intense. We were actually doing it. We were surviving up here. Ethan glanced at his son, the boy's youthful enthusiasm, a stark contrast to the grim reality around them. He wanted to protect Alex, to keep him safe in the bunker, but he knew that wasn't possible anymore. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, his breath visible in the icy air. Alex might have been excited, but Ethan felt only dread. The surface was worse than he'd imagined, a wasteland crawling with radiation mutants, twisted remnants of humanity's greed and recklessness. The underground bunker had been their prison, yes, but it had also been their sanctuary out here. There was nothing but cold and death. He crouched next to the door, peering through the shattered window frame. The mutants weren't hunting in packs, at least not yet, but that didn't mean they were safe. The wind whipped through the ruins, carrying the bitter sting of ash. He turned to the others. We'll rest here for a few minutes, then keep moving. We need to make it to the supply depot by nightfall, Ethan said, his voice low but firm. Dr. Harper was already pulling out her portable scanner, the small device whirring softly as it measured the radiation levels in the area. Her expression shifted to one of concern. Radiation here is still high. If we don't find proper shelter soon, we're going to start seeing symptoms within a few hours. This place isn't going to cut it for long, she said. Ethan nodded grimly. He expected as much. The nuclear fallout was still strong, and while they were protected by their makeshift gear, exposure would soon take its toll. He just hoped the old supply depot hadn't been completely looted in the chaos that followed the war. Alex sat down beside him, pulling his scarf tighter around his neck. Dad, you think there's still food in the depot water? I mean, it's been a year. What if we find nothing? Ethan glanced at his son, then back out into the ruins. There's always a chance we find nothing. But we won. And unless we try, we can't give up just because it looks bad. That's sort of what survival is. Alex, you keep pushing forward no matter what. Alex nodded, but his eyes flickered with doubt. He was still a boy, despite everything, and the harshness of the world outside had only just begun to sink in. Lucy and Greg had taken up positions by the window, scanning the streets for any sign of movement. Greg was an ex-construction worker, his broad frame now worn down by months of malnutrition, but he was still strong, still capable. Lucy had been a nurse before everything collapsed, and her quiet determination made her invaluable in the bunker. Now she was just as valuable out here, keeping the group focused, alert. We need to go, Lucy said, after a few moments. The wind, some picking up. I don't like the way it sounds out there. Ethan agreed. He could hear it too, a keening howl that rose and fell as if something unnatural was carried with it. He wasn't keen to find out if it was just the wind or something worse. They moved quickly, leaving the ruined store behind and heading deeper into the city. The supply depot was only a few miles from the bunker, but the journey felt endless. Every step was heavy, weighed down by the freezing air and the constant threat of attack. The shadows seemed to shift around them, making it impossible to shake the feeling that they were being watched. Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle as they approached a set of crumbling high-rises. The old depot was nearby, hidden beneath the remnants of a once busy government building. It had been stocked for a catastrophe, but who knew how much remained? As they reached the depot's entrance, Ethan motioned for the others to stop. The massive steel door was still intact, but the lock mechanism was fused, damaged by the war. They would have to force their way in. Greg, help me with this, Ethan said. Greg nodded, setting his pack down and pulling out a heavy-duty crowbar. The two men worked in silence, prying at the door's edges until with a loud groan, the steel gave way. The door swung open, revealing a dark, empty corridor that led down into the bowels of the earth. The air was musty, thick with dust and decay. Ethan flicked on his flashlight and stepped inside, the beam cutting through the darkness. The depot had been untouched, at least by human hands, for over a year. He could only hope it hadn't been looted, or worse, overtaken by mutants. The walls were lined with old posters, government warnings about nuclear preparedness, and faded signs pointing to emergency supplies. The group moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Ethan could feel the tension in the air. Even Alex had gone quiet, his earlier excitement replaced by a nervous edge. They were deep enough underground that they were safe from radiation, but there were other dangers to worry about. They reached the main storage area, a large room filled with shelves upon shelves of supply. Most of it was still there, food, water, medicine, even weapons. Relief flooded Ethan as he realized they had found exactly what they needed. "Jackpot," Alex whispered, his face breaking into a grin for the first time in hours. Ethan allowed himself a small smile. "Yeah, looks like it." But the feeling of victory was short-lived. Dr. Harper's sharp intake of breath made Ethan spin around, his rifle raised. She was standing near the far end of the room, her flashlight illuminating a pile of bodies, human bodies. "Ethan," she said quietly, "they're dead, but it doesn't look like mutants got to them." Ethan approached slowly, his heart sinking. The bodies were huddled together, their faces twisted in agony, but there were no signs of external injuries. No blood, no broken bones, just death. "Radiation poisoning," Dr. Harper murmured. "They must have thought they were safe down here, but something went wrong. The filtration system failed, or maybe they stayed too long without proper protection. Either way, they didn't make it." Ethan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This place, this catch of supplies, had been someone else. Its last hope, and now it was a tomb. "We need to be careful," he said, his voice tight. "Take what we need and get out. We can't just stay here long." The others nodded, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by grim efficiency. They worked quickly, packing food, water, and medical supplies into their bag. Alex stayed close to Ethan, his eyes darting nervously toward the pile of bodies, as if expecting them to rise any moment. As they finished gathering the supplies, Lucy spoke up. "We should get back to the bunker as soon as possible. This place gives me the creep." Ethan agreed. The longer they stayed here, the more exposed they were. But just as they turned to leave, the sound of something scraping against metal echoed from the corridor behind them. Ethan froze, his finger hovering over the trigger of his rifle. "Did you hear that?" Greg whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Ethan nodded, motioning for silence. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. And then from the shadows of the corridor emerged a figure. At first it looked human, dressed in tattered clothing, its face gaunt and hollow. But as it stepped into the light, Ethan realized with horror that it wasn't human at all. Its eyes glowed with the same sickly green light as the mutant they had encountered earlier, and its skin was stretched too tightly over its bones, giving it a grotesque, almost skeletal appearance. The mutant lunged forward with an inhuman screech, and Ethan fired, the bullet slamming into its chest. It staggered, but didn't he fall? 2 more shots, and finally, the creature collapsed, lunging as it bled out on the floor. For a moment, the group stood in stunned silence, their breath heavy in the cold air. Then Dr. Harper stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "We need to leave now," she said. Ethan didn't need convincing. They rushed out of the depot, their packs heavy with supplies, but their hearts pounding with fear. The mutants were becoming more aggressive, more dangerous, and the longer they stayed on the surface, the more they were exposed to the harsh realities of this new world. As they made their way back to the bunker, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The shadows seemed to follow them, the wind carrying whispers that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. They reached the bunker just as night began to fall, the sky darkening to an impenetrable black. The entrance sealed behind them with a reassuring hiss, and for the first time in hours, Ethan allowed himself to relax. But as he looked at the supplies they had brought back, at the faces of the survivors who were counting on him, he realized that this was only the beginning. They had food and water now, but that wouldn't last forever. The mutants were getting stronger, more organized, and the people in the bunker, they were scared, desperate. Ethan knew that the hardest part was yet to come. He was their leader, their protector, but even he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it all together. The world outside was broken, and it was only a matter of time before the bunker followed. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The sky turned black in an instant. One moment, Lucas Carter was halfway through his sandwich, fixing a faulty fuse box on the 28th floor of a downtown high-rise. The next, he was staring out the window at an unearthly darkness swallowing the city. It wasn't an eclipse. The sun didn't fade or dim, it simply vanished. At first, Lucas thought it was just a power outage, a strange one, sure, but nothing he hadn't dealt with before. But the light stayed off. The emergency systems didn't kick in. As he fumbled for his flashlight, he noticed something chilling. None of the cars on the street below were moving. Traffic lights were dead, too. The entire city was lifeless, except for the faint, panicked glow of phone screens coming on in offices and apartments around him. The city's usual hum had disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence. That silence was interrupted by the distant sound of something crashing, metal twisting, glass shattering. Lucas looked down and saw a delivery truck had plowed into a storefront. The driver stumbled out, dazed, looking around like the darkness had somehow blinded him. "What the hell is going on?" Lucas muttered, his hands shaking as he grabbed his tool bag and slung it over his shoulder. He needed to get home fast. The building stairwell was darker than he expected. His flashlight barely pierced the thick blackness around him, and each step seemed to echo unnaturally, as if the world itself was hollow. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. A freak storm, a massive solar flare. He reached for his phone to check the news, but there was no signal, no bars, no data, not even an emergency alert. By the time he reached the ground floor, the lobby was a mess. The night guard had bolted from his desk, and the revolving doors were jammed half open. Outside, the city was in chaos. People were running, screaming, calling for loved ones. Car alarms blared, but none of the vehicles moved. The sky above was a perfect black void. No stars, no moon, just endless darkness. Lucas fought the rising panic in his chest. He had to get home, check on his wife, Sarah. She'd been sick for the past week, barely able to get out of bed. His apartment was only a few blocks away, but the streets were quickly becoming a danger zone. People were abandoning their cars, running on foot, screaming about shadows, moving in the dark. He jogged past a convenience store, its windows smashed, looters inside grabbing whatever they could. A man ran out with an armful of water bottles, only to trip and spill them across the sidewalk. No one was thinking straight. Everyone was terrified, including Lucas. The first sign that something was truly wrong came in the form of a shrill, inhuman scream. Lucas froze in his tracks, turning toward the alley where the sound had come from. There, just at the edge of his flashlight's send beam, something moved. It was tall, too tall to be human. Its limbs were impossibly long, its skin a glossy black sheen that blended seamlessly with the darkness around it. The thing screeched again, its mouth opening too wide for its narrow face, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Lucas took a step back, heart pounding. He wasn't prepared for this. No one was. The creature lunged. Lucas barely dodged in time, stumbling into the street as the thing's claws raked across the pavement with a metallic screech. It moved faster than any living thing should, its body a blur of shadow. He ran, not daring to look back as the thing chased him down the deserted street. His apartment was only a block away, but it felt like miles. He sprinted, his lungs burning, heart hammering in his chest. He could hear the creature's footfalls behind him, quick, light, inhuman. And then just as he reached the front door of his building, the creature stopped. It let out a low, guttural growl, then vanished back into the shadows, as if it had never been there. Lucas turned, panting, his flashlight shaking as he pointed it toward the darkness. Nothing. The street was empty, save for the distant screams of the terrified. He didn't waste any time. He raced up the stairs, 3 at a time, ignoring the pain in his leg. By the time he reached his apartment door, he was drenched in sweat, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the key. "Sarah?" he called out as he burst inside. The apartment was cold, eerily quiet, his breath fogged in front of him. He rushed to the bedroom, praying to find her safe. Sarah was there, sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "Lucas, what's happening?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," he admitted, sitting beside her and grabbing her hand. "The sun's gone, the power sign out everywhere, and there's something out there, in the dark." Her grip tightened on his. "What do we do?" "We were going to be okay," he lied, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'll figure this out." For the next few hours, they huddled together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the city unraveling around them. The strange screeches and howls outside became more frequent, closer. Whatever those creatures were, they were multiplying, growing bolder. Lucas knew they couldn't stay in the apartment forever. They needed food, supplies, and a plan. But most importantly, they needed light. Without it, they were sitting duck. Morning, or what should have been morning, came and the city was still cloaked in darkness. Lucas made a decision. He couldn't just wait for help to come. No one was coming if the sun didn't return. Humanity was on the brink of extinction. I am going out, he said, pulling on his coat. I need to find a way to get the power back on. Sarat's eyes filled with fear. You can go out there, those things. I'll be careful, he said, though the memory of the creature still haunted him. I know how to get to the power grid. If I can restart it, at least we'll have light. Reluctantly, she nodded, squeezing his hand one last time before letting him go. Lucas packed a bag with what little supplies they had: a flashlight, a few tools, some food and water, and stepped back out into the eternal night. The streets were even more desolate now. Most of the panicked civilians had barricaded themselves in their homes or fled the city. The once bustling metropolis was now a ghost town with only the occasional scurrying shadow reminding him that he wasn't alone. He made his way toward the electrical substation where he'd worked countless times before. It was one of the few places that might still have backup power. If he could get the grid online, even partially, it would at least push back the darkness, give people a fighting chance. But as he approached the substation, he realized he wasn't the only one with this idea. A group of survivors, about a dozen of them, were gathered outside the fence, armed with makeshift weapons, pipes, crowbars, and kitchen knives. Their leader, a tall, muscular man with a shaved head, was barking orders at them, trying to break into the locked facility. Lucas hesitated. Approaching a group of desperate strangers could be just as dangerous as the creatures in the dark, but he needed access to the substation, and they seemed determined to get inside. He approached cautiously, hands raised to show he wasn't a threat. Hey, he called out, I am an electrician. I can help you get the power back on. The leader turned to him, eyes narrowing. And why should we trust you? Because without me, you were not getting that grid up, Lucas said, and you were going to need power if you want to survive. The man considered this for a moment before nodding. Fine. But if you try anything, you were dead. Got it? Lucas nodded, swallowing his nerve. Lucas stepped through the group cautiously, feeling their suspicious eyes on him as he approached the substation's fence. It had been a while since he'd been here for work, but he knew the layout like the back of his hand. He could see the damage already. Chunks of the wiring had been ripped out, and parts of the grid control system looked fried. It wasn't going to be an easy fix, but it was possible. You were going to need to give me some space, waving the survivors back. The last thing he needed was someone crowding him while he tried to rewire a live circuit. The leader, who had introduced himself as Marcus, grunted but gestured for the others to step back. Lucas got to work, pulling out a few tools from his bag. His hands shook slightly from the cold and the anxiety gnawing at him, but he forced himself to focus. He was almost done when something crashed in the distance, a loud metallic thud that echoed through the city streets, followed by a long, bone-chilling screech. The group tensed immediately, eyes darting toward the source of the sound. Lucas glanced over his shoulder, his stomach twisting. He had a bad feeling. They're coming, in, the group muttered, clutching her metal pipe tightly. That those things, they always come when it's quiet. Lucas worked faster, sweat forming on his brow despite the cold. The power grid was close to coming back online, but it wasn't there yet. He just needed a few more minutes. The screeching grew louder. Closer, a shadow darted across the far end of the street, a long, spindly figure moving unnaturally fast. Lucas felt a surge of adrenaline if he didn't get the power up. Now they were all dead. Come on, he muttered, his fingers flying over the control. The system buzzed to life, flickering, then stabilizing with a low hum. The lights in the substation flickered and then stayed on, casting a pale glow over the area. It's working, one of the survivors shouted, relief in their voice. But the relief was short-lived. As the first few streetlights buzzed on, the screeching intensified. The creatures hated the light, but they weren't running this time. They were angry, furious. Lucas barely had time to step back before one of them launched itself at the fence, its elongated limbs wrapping around the metal bar. The thing hissed, its milky white eyes glowing faintly as it clawed at the barrier. Its skin was slick and black, as if it had been pulled straight from the shadows themselves. Get back, Marcus shouted, swinging a crowbar at the creature. It screeched in response, recoiling just enough for Marcus to drive the metal bar into its head. The creature crumpled to the ground, twitching. More were coming, dozens of them, skittering across the streets, leaping from rooftops, crawling out of the darkness. The survivors formed a tight circle, weapons raised, but they were outnumbered, and the creatures weren't stopping. "Get inside," Lucas yelled, backing toward the substation. "DC, we can hold them off in here." They didn't need to be told twice. The group rushed inside, slamming the heavy door shut just as the creatures swarmed the fence. The metal rattled violently as they clawed at it, their screeches filling the air. Inside the substation was a tight space filled with humming machinery and a faint smell of ozone. It wasn't exactly secure, but it was better than being out in the open. Marcus paced, his brow furrowed in frustration. "Terry, we need more than just these lights. This is barely keeping them at bay." Lucas nodded, wiping sweat from his face. "The grid, sell up. But it's I need to get to the main power plant if we want to light up the whole city. But that's miles away, and who knows what kind of condition it's in after all this." Marie, a quiet woman who had stuck close to Lucas during the chaos, finally spoke up. "We don't have a choice, do we? We can survive like this. Those things won't stop until we all dead." Lucas glanced at her, recognizing the fear in her eyes. It was the same fear everyone had. The same fear gnawing at him, too, but she was right. Sitting in the substation wasn't a long-term plan. They needed real power, something that would give them more than a few flickering lights. He looked around at the group. Most of them were battered, exhausted, and scared out of their minds. But they were all that was left of this part of the city, and they had to make a stand. "We go to the power plant," Lucas said firmly. "It's our best shot." Marcus nodded slowly. "And what about those things out there? Not just gonna let us walk out of here?" Lucas clenched his jaw. That was the problem. The creatures were relentless, swarming anything that moved. He'd have seen them up close now, seen their speed, their hunger. They weren't just mindless beasts. They were something else, something worse. But they couldn't stay here. The lights wouldn't last, and when the power finally cut out again, the creatures would break through that fence without hesitation. "We'll need weapons, whatever we can find," Terry Lucas said. "Do it, and we move fast. No one gets left behind." The group nodded, gathering whatever they could use as makeshift weapons. A few of them had found flashlights and batteries, their beams cutting through the heavy darkness outside. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Marcus hefted his crowbar, looking grim. "Tari, let's get this over with." Lucas led the way, pushing open the door just enough for them to slip out one by one. The street was eerily quiet now, the creatures having retreated into the shadows, but he could feel them watching, waiting. They moved quickly, sticking to the dim pools of light cast by the street lamp. Every flicker of movement in the shadows made Lucas' psychic heart skip a beat, but they pressed on, heading toward the distant outline of the power plant. It loomed like a dark monolith against the endless black sky. Halfway there, the creatures struck again. They came from above this time, dropping from the rooftops with terrifying speed. One of the survivors screamed as a creature grabbed him, dragging him into the shadows. The others swung their makeshift weapons, beating back the attackers as best they could. "Run!" Lucas shouted, swinging his flashlight wildly as he bolted down the street. The group scattered, running toward the power plant, their footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. Lucas didn't dare look back. He could hear the creatures behind them gaining ground. He pushed harder, his lungs burning, legs screaming in protest. Finally, the power plant's gates came into view. Lucas slammed into them, fumbling with the old lock until it gave way, and the group poured inside, panting and terrified. They lingered outside, watching from the shadows, their milky eyes glowing faintly in the distance. "We were safe for now," Marie panted, leaning against a wall. Lucas wasn't so sure. The power plant was massive, a maze of rusting machinery and silent generators. Getting it back online was going to be a nightmare, especially with those creatures still out there. He glanced at the others. They were exhausted, barely holding on. But this was their last chance. If they didn't get the city power grid fully online, it wouldn't matter how long they hid, the darkness would eventually consume them. Lucas took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Here, I'll need help getting the generators running. It's going to take all of us." The group nodded, but determined there was no other option. As Lucas moved deeper into the power plant, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Something worse than the creatures outside. There was a tension in the air, an almost oppressive darkness that seemed to pulse and shift with every step he took. And then he saw it. In the distance, half hidden behind the massive turbines, stood a figure. Dressed in dark robes, the figure's face was obscured by a hood, but Lucas could feel its gaze on him. It wasn't one of the creatures, it was something else, something human. Before he could call out, the figure vanished into the shadow. Lucas saw his heart pounded in his chest as he turned back to the group. Shirobare, we're not alone in here. The others exchanged nervous glances. Let's just focus on the generators, Marcus said, gripping his crowbar tighter. But Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that whatever or whoever was in the power plant with them wasn't going to make this easy. As they worked, the lights flickered on and off, casting eerie shadows that danced across the wall. Every creak and groan of the machinery made Lucas' own nerves fray a little more. And then, just as they were about to bring the main generator online, a voice echoed through the plant. You shouldn't tell him here. Lucas spun around, but there was no one there. The figure from earlier stepped out of the shadows again, this time closer. Its hood was pulled back, revealing a face half covered in strange markings glowing faintly in the darkness. You were meddling with forces you don't understand, Ferdic, the figure said, its voice low and threatening. Lucas stood his ground, heart racing. We were trying to survive. The figure smiled, chilling expression. Before Lucas could respond, the figure melted back into the shadows, disappearing as it had appeared. Lucas turned to the others, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Die cries, finish this. The main generator roared to life with a deafening hum, and for the first time since the sun had disappeared, the city's lights blazed back on. But as the light flooded the streets, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't just saved themselves. They had awakened something far worse. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The wind howled like a beast as Dr. Alex Reed stood at the edge of the crumbling observation deck, staring into the distance where the horizon was no longer visible. The storm had swallowed it whole. He could feel the vibrations beneath his feet, the sheer force of the winds threatening to tear the city apart. He tightened his grip on the steel railing, knowing that in just a matter of hours the storm would reach landfall and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. For weeks, Alex had been tracking these storms. As a meteorologist with the Global Weather Monitoring Center, he had seen every kind of weather anomaly imaginable. Tornadoes, hurricanes, typhoons, he'd studied them all, but this was different. The sheer scale of the destruction, the speed at which these storms formed, was like nothing he'd ever seen. Cities were being flattened as if they were nothing more than sandcastles in the path of a tidal wave. And yet, the patterns didn't make sense. There was something off about the data, something he couldn't shake. He took a deep breath, pulling away from the railing as the sound of approaching footsteps broke through the deafening roar of the wind. His colleague Sarah hurried up to him, her face pale beneath the harsh lights of the observation deck. Alex, it's still happening again. Tokyo, it's been hit. Alex clenched his jaw. Another city gone. Another tragedy that could have been prevented if only people would listen. He turned to face Sarah, her wide eyes filled with a mix of fear and disbelief. How bad is it? She swallowed hard, her voice shaking. The storm hit faster than expected. There was no time to evacuate. Millions are gone. Alex felt a cold knot form in his stomach, and the pattern. Sarah handed him the latest data on a tablet, her hands trembling. He scanned the information, and there it was again, that same strange anomaly. The storm had formed too perfectly, too quickly. It wasn't too random. It wasn't natural. We need to warn the others, Sarah said, her voice urgent. We need to tell them what you found. Alex shook his head, frustration boiling over. They won. T, listen. I've tried. They think I am crazy for even suggesting that this isn't natural. Sarah's eyes darkened with determination. Then we need proof. Real proof. We can. Let this continue. Alex stared at the screen, the digital image of Tokyo skyline now. Just a ghost beneath the swirling mass of the storm. There's something I've been tracking, he said slowly, his mind racing. The storm formations, they were originating from a single point in the middle of the ocean. Sarah says, brow furrowed, but that's impossible. There's no system out there that could cause that. Unless Alex hesitated, the thought forming in his mind like a dark cloud, unless it's being created. Sarah blinked. Created. You think someone is doing this on purpose? Alex nodded grimly. We need to dig deeper. There's something more going on here, something they were not telling us. 2 days later, Alex found himself sitting in a cramped diner in the middle of nowhere. his hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee. Across from him sat the one person he thought might have the answers. Dr. Evelyn Cole, his former mentor and one of the leading experts in climate science. Her sharp eyes studied him from over the rim of her coffee cup, and for a moment, the old familiar tension between them resurfaced. "It's been a while," Evelyn said, setting her cup down with a quiet clink. "I didn't think I'd hear from you again." "I wish this were a social call," Alex replied, pulling a folder from his bag and sliding it across the table. "But I need your help. I think there's something big happening, and I am running out of time to figure it out." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, flipping open the folder and skimming through the data. "Storm formations, wind patterns. This looks like a weather anomaly." "It's not," Alex said, his voice low. "Look at the origin points. Every single storm, starting from the same location." Evelyn's brow furrowed as she examined the data more closely. "That's impossible." "Exactly," Alex said, leaning forward unless someone is controlling it. Evelyn's eyes widened. "You were not saying—" "I am," Alex interrupted. "Do you remember Tempest?" Evelyn sat back in her chair, her face going pale. "I thought that project was shut down. Climate warfare, ... It was banned years ago." "It was," Alex said, "but someone has reactivated and they were using it to wipe cities off the map." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the edge of the folder. "If you were right, this could be catastrophic." "Tempest wasn't just a theoretical project. It was built, tested, and if it's been reactivated, millions will die." Alex finished for her. Evelyn's mind raced. "But who would do this, and why?" "That's what I need your help to figure out," Alex said. "I've been trying to trace the source, but I am running out of leads. You have connections, people who know things." Evelyn hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the window where the wind had begun to pick up, rattling the glass. "If Tempest has been reactivated, it's only a matter of time before the next storm hits. We don't have long." Alex nodded. "Which is why we need to move fast. I need access to classified government files, encrypted communications, anything that can point us in the right direction." Evelyn sighed, rubbing her temples. "I'll make some calls, but Alex, you need to understand, if we recut digging into this, we'll be labeled as traitors. You could lose everything." "I've already lost enough," Alex said quietly. "I can tell I stand by and watch this happen." Evelyn studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, but we do this my way." By the next morning, Evelyn had secured access to a hidden network of government files, a web of secrets that Alex could never have breached alone. The information came in waves: encrypted messages, surveillance footage, classified reports. And there it was, Tempest, a climate weapon designed to manipulate weather patterns on a massive scale. Originally conceived as a defense mechanism, it had been shelved after international bans on climate warfare. But someone had reactivated it, and now they were using it to hold the world hostage. Alex and Evelyn worked tirelessly, tracing the digital breadcrumbs back to their source. It wasn't too long before they found the connection: a defense contractor named Titan Industries, known for their black ops projects and their willingness to do whatever it took to get ahead. And at the center of it all was one man, Jacob Sinclair, CEO of Titan Industries and the mastermind behind Tempest. "He's playing both sides," Evelyn said, her voice tense as she stared at the data. "He started using the storms to destabilize governments, forcing them to buy his protection against the very disasters he set creating." Alex shook his head in disbelief. "He sent a madman." "He's more than that," Evelyn replied. "He's sent dangerous, and if we don't stop him, the next storm will be even worse." They stared at the screen, where the next storm's trajectory was being plotted in real time. It was massive, bigger than anything they'd seen before, and it was headed straight for Washington. Alex's pulse quickened as he and Evelyn stared at the storm's projection. The sheer scale of it was staggering, a swirling mass of destruction that would obliterate anything in its path. Washington, D.C. wasn't just the capital of the United States, it was the epicenter of global politics, housing not only national leaders but also foreign diplomats and critical infrastructure. The implications were clear. The entire world would be thrown into chaos. "We have to stop this," Alex muttered, running his hands through his hair in frustration. Evelyn's fingers moved quickly over her keyboard, scanning through files and encrypted communication. "There's only one way we can stop it. We have to shut down Tempest directly. It's not just a matter of hacking into it remotely. This system is deep, buried in layers of security protocols. So what do we do?" She looked up at him, her expression grim, tricky. "We go to the source." Alex's heart sank. He knew what she meant. The source was Titan Industries, hidden in a remote offshore facility that was notoriously secure. It was practically a fortress. Breaking into it wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. But they had no choice. The storm was already forming and they had only hours left before it hit. Evelyn wasn't wasting time. She was already calling in a favor from an old contact. Within minutes, they were en route to a nondescript airstrip where they met up with Nathan Hale, a former military officer turned counterintelligence agent. Nathan had the connections, the skills, and the knowledge to get them inside the facility. He also had his own score to settle with Sinclair, the man who had ruined his career by burying him in a scandal years ago. Nathan's arrival wasn't particularly friendly. He had the sharp cutting gaze of a man who had been burned too many times and was now operating purely on survival instinct. His gruff demeanor softened slightly when he looked at Evelyn, whom he clearly respected. But to Alex, he offered nothing but cold stares. "You were the meteorologist, right?" Nathan said flatly as they boarded the small unmarked vessel that would take them to the facility. "Yeah," Alex replied, trying to ignore the undercurrent of disdain in Nathan's tone. "Good. Stick to reading the clouds and let me handle the rest." Evelyn shot Nathan a look. "He's more than that. Nathan, he says the reason we know what's going on." Nathan grunted but said nothing more. The boat sliced through the dark waters, heading toward the storm brewing on the horizon. The wind had already picked up, the waves crashing violently against the hull. Time was running out. The facility loomed ahead like a dark steel monster rising from the ocean. It was massive, reinforced with concrete and surrounded by a perimeter of guards and drones. Getting in would be impossible, at least for anyone without Nathan's expertise. As they approached, Nathan worked quickly, using an old access code from his military days to slip past the facility, now outer security. It wasn't a flawless plan. They would only have a short window before the system caught on to the breach, but it would have to be enough. Once inside, the atmosphere shifted. The sterile, cold interior of the facility felt like a different world cut off from the chaos outside. The whir of machinery and the faint hum of power generators were the only sound. Alex felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were on borrowed time. "Stay close," Nathan muttered, leading them down a series of narrow, metallic hallways. He had memorized the facility's cell layout, and his steps were precise, confident. They passed several armed guards, ducking into alcoves and side passages whenever necessary. The storm's rumble grew louder, and Alex's stomach churned. He could feel the pressure building both inside and out. The control center was at the heart of the facility, and getting to it would require a direct confrontation with Sinclair's security forces. They didn't have the luxury of sneaking around forever. Nathan signaled for them to halt just outside the control room entrance. He glanced back at Alex and Evelyn, his eyes hard. "Once we go in, there's no turning back. We take Sinclair down, or we don't come out at all." Alex nodded, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had never been in a situation like this before. His life had been defined by data science and prediction, but now he was standing on the edge of something far more dangerous, far more real. Nathan kicked open the door and chaos erupted. The room was filled with technicians and guards, all caught off guard by the sudden breach. Nathan moved swiftly, disarming 2 guards before they even had time to react. Evelyn rushed to the main console, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she attempted to access the system. But Sinclair was waiting for them. From the shadows of the control room, Jacob Sinclair emerged, his face twisted in a smirk. He was tall, imposing, dressed in a sleek, tailored suit that seemed out of place amidst the industrial environment. His eyes glinted with a dangerous mix of arrogance and madness. "Dr. Raid, Dr. Cole," Sinclair said, his voice smooth and taunting. "I must say I am impressed you made it this far, but did you really think you could stop me?" Nathan moved to strike, but Sinclair's security forces were quicker. Armed guards flooded the room, weapons raised, and for a moment, it seemed like all hope was lost. Alex's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but it was Evelyn who acted. She had managed to gain partial access to the Tempest system, and with a few keystrokes, she triggered an emergency override. The storm generator powered down slightly, its readings dropping. Sinclair's darkened. "Do you even know what you're redoing?" Sinclair hissed. Are you re-tampering with forces you can't? You're replaying God with people's sex lives. Evelyn shot back, her voice filled with fury. Sorry, this ends now. But Sinclair wasn't done. He reached for a hidden control on his wrist, activating a secondary fail-safe that reactivated the storm generator at full power. The room shook violently as the entire facility responded to the surge of energy. The storm outside intensified, winds howling with renewed fury. Alex's heart pounded as the realization hit him. They were out of time. The storm was going to hit, and nothing they did now could stop it. But Nathan had one final move. In the midst of the chaos, he saw the only way out the generator side power source. He lunged for it, taking out several guards along the way, but the cost was high. A shot rang out, and Nathan collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath it. Shut it down, Nathan gasped, his voice weak but filled with urgency. Evelyn acted quickly, her hands moving faster than Alex had ever seen. With one final command, she disabled the entire system, plunging the facility into darkness. The storm generator whined to a halt, and for a brief moment, there was silence. Sinclair stared at the now dark control panels, his expression one of disbelief. "Are you fools? Do you even understand what you've done?" Evelyn stepped forward, her voice cold. "Pray, we saved the world from you." Sinclair made one last, desperate move to activate a backup, but Alex was quicker. He slammed his fist into Sinclair's jaw, knocking him unconscious. The storm outside was subsiding, the wind slowly dying down. It was over. As Alex and Evelyn dragged Nathan's injured form out of the control room and onto the deck, they watched as the storm clouds began to clear. The devastation was immense, but they had prevented the worst. The world would rebuild. Nathan's breath was shallow, his strength fading. "So you did it," He whispered, a faint smile on his lips. He actually did it. Evelyn knelt beside him, her face tight with grief. "Seriously, we couldn't have done it without you." Nathan's eyes closed, and the weight of his sacrifice hung heavy in the air. As the sun broke through the clouds, Alex stood in silence, staring at the horizon. The storm was gone, but the cost had been high. He knew that the truth about Tempest and Sinclair would come out eventually, and when it did, the world would have to reckon with the reality of climate warfare. But for now, the storm had passed.